A religious leader transformed into a divine messenger finds himself stationed near a waterway in the ancient land of Babylon when he suddenly encounters something that completely transcends human comprehension. Beings possessing four distinct faces, circular structures nested within one another, and a sapphire-colored seat of power suspended in the sky above. This marks the initial vision granted to Ezekiel, and this represents merely the starting point of one of the most remarkable prophetic experiences ever documented in written history. From consuming written scrolls to remaining positioned on one side of his body for more than 12 months, from observing the divine glory, departing from the sacred temple, to viewing an entire valley filled with lifeless bones rising up to form a mighty army, the narrative of Ezekiel reads unlike anything else found in ancient written works. But here's the detail that escapes most people's awareness regarding the Book of Ezekiel. This text holds more elaborate accounts of encounters with the supernatural than nearly any other biblical book. It includes precise architectural specifications for a sacred structure that remains unbuilt to this day and presents predictions so remarkably detailed that those who doubted its authenticity once insisted it must have been composed following the actual events, until discoveries through archaeology demonstrated they were mistaken. In this presentation, we're going to examine every single chapter, every vision granted, and every prediction made, arranging them in the order they occurred, drawing connections between the ancient world Ezekiel inhabited and the questions that continue to challenge those who study theology, those who research history, and minds driven by curiosity even today. But before we proceed further, if this channel is new to you, think about pressing that like button and the subscribe button if you haven't done so yet. The support you provide enables us to keep producing additional content that delivers greater value. Also, share with us your current location and what hour it is where you are. We're creating a worldwide community right here, so you have the opportunity to connect with others who think similarly from every corner of the globe in the comment area below. All right. Shall we begin exploring today's video? The year stands at 593 years before the Common Era began. Positioned along the shores of the Kebar waterway in the ancient territory of Babylon, a young religious priest bearing the name Ezekiel sits surrounded by those who share his exile. The sacred temple in Jerusalem continues to stand upright, but the magnificence it once held feels impossibly distant at this moment. These individuals have been ripped away from the land they called home, transported here by the military forces under King Nebuchadnezzar's command 5 years in the past. Their existence now unfolds in designated settlements, cultivating unfamiliar ground, speaking in voices barely above whispers about the city they were forced to abandon. Ezekiel possesses complete knowledge of the priestly customs by memory. His upbringing led him to anticipate serving within the temple's walls, presenting offerings to God, preserving the holy ceremonies and practices. But in this place, removed so far from the sacred mountain, the preparation he received feels hollow and without purpose. The other displaced people turn their eyes toward him, seeking reassurance, seeking answers concerning what lies ahead for them. He possesses nothing to offer in response to their unspoken questions. Then the barriers of heaven are torn apart. The day commences as any other day would. Ezekiel moves alongside the canal's edge, observing the water as it flows in the direction of faraway territories. The sky stretching above Babylon appears bright and cloudless. With absolutely no advance indication, storm formations begin gathering from the northern direction. The wind picks up strength, bringing along with it something that causes the small hairs along his arms to rise straight up. This represents no typical weather pattern. The approaching storm moves with speed that defies natural explanation. Bolts of lightning flash across the sky, but these don't follow the familiar irregular patterns he recognizes. These electrical discharges move in formations, showing perfect organization as though directed by hands that cannot be seen. The thunder doesn't travel rolling across the expanse above. It beats with a steady rhythm, resembling a heartbeat amplified 1,000 times over. The atmosphere itself appears to vibrate, with a presence emerging from inside the storm. From within this disturbance, Ezekiel perceives fire. Not the untamed flames of burning forests, but fire radiating amber and bronze hues, held within boundaries yet alive and moving. This fire advances with clear intention, rotating and moving in patterns far too intricate for human minds to comprehend fully. As the phenomenon draws nearer, distinct shapes start emerging from the intense luminosity. 4 living beings step forward from the flames. They stand in upright positions similar to human beings, but their physical forms shine with the appearance of polished bronze metal. Every single creature possesses 4 faces, those of human, lion, ox, and eagle, directing their gaze in all directions simultaneously. Their wings extend outward, covering their bodies, yet somehow they achieve movement with absolute grace and coordination. The sound produced by their wings resembles rushing waters in motion, comparable to the voice of the Almighty when speaking from Mount Sinai. These beings do not travel alone. Positioned beside each creature stands a wheel, but these circular structures defy every principle of the natural world that Ezekiel understands. They tower high above the surface of the ground, their outer edges completely covered with eyes that blink and observe and perceive all things. When the creatures advance forward, the wheels advance alongside them, not by rolling motion, but gliding as though the earth itself transports them. The wheels emit a shine like beryl, that valuable stone that captures illumination and retains it within. But these wheels contain yet another wheel positioned within them, crossing at angles of perfect precision. They possess the ability to move toward any direction without the need to turn, north or south, east or west, following the spirit dwelling within the living creatures. The eyes positioned around their outer rims never shut, never pause in their vigilance, maintaining constant watch over the world spread below them. Above these creatures extends an expanse resembling crystal material, but alive in nature, similar to ice that has captured the light of 1,000 suns within itself. The expanse spreads over them in the shape of a dome, and emanating from it comes a voice that renders the thunder into something like a whisper by comparison. The sound carries qualities both terrifying and beautiful, resembling the ocean colliding with the shoreline in a cycle that never ends. Resting upon the expanse sits a throne. This throne gives the impression of being constructed from sapphire, that blue-colored stone that holds within it the depth found in the sky itself. But this throne does not sit empty without an occupant. A figure rests upon it, and though Ezekiel strains his vision, attempting to see with clarity, the glory shining forth proves too brilliant for eyes belonging to mortals. The figure presents the appearance of a human being, but exists surrounded by fire and rainbow illumination that shifts and transforms like precious stones that possess life. The fire surrounding the throne burns in both upward and downward directions, generating a brilliant amber radiance that fills the complete vision. A rainbow forms an arc around the throne, its colors displaying more intensity than any rainbow that follows earthly precipitation. The light doesn't cause pain when looked upon directly. It pulls the eye toward it the way a magnet pulls iron filings toward itself. Beautiful in ways that surpass description. This represents the glory belonging to the Lord. This is the God of Israel, the same one who communicated with Moses from within the burning bush, who guided the people through the wilderness territory, who makes his dwelling in the temple located in Jerusalem. But now, in this moment, here in Babylon, positioned far from the holy city, God reveals himself to an exiled priest beside a waterway in foreign lands. Ezekiel collapses with his face toward the earth. The glory overwhelms his senses, pressing him downward to the ground like a weight beyond his capacity to bear. The priestly instruction he received has taught him concerning the holiness of God. But no words existing in Hebrew or Aramaic possess the capacity to capture what his eyes perceive. This is the divine presence without any filtering, the source from which all light and life and power originate. The vision burns its way into his memory with permanent impression. Every single detail, the faces of the creatures, the wheels positioned within wheels, the rainbow encircling the throne, becomes integrated into his very being. He will carry these images throughout the remainder of his life, and they will give shape to every word he utters as a prophet. As the vision begins fading from view, Ezekiel remains positioned on the ground, completely overwhelmed by what he has been permitted to witness. The storm moves past, but the significance it carries continues to linger. God is not confined within the temple in Jerusalem. The divine presence moves with complete freedom, traveling upon the wings of cherubim, unrestricted by structures built by human hands or by territorial boundaries. The other exiled people discover him in that location, face pressed down beside the canal, trembling with the after effects of divine encounter. They assist him in rising to his feet, but he cannot form words to speak of what he has experienced. Not at this moment. The vision remains too fresh, too overwhelming to share through verbal communication. Instead, he carries it within himself like a burning coal, waiting for the moment when God will release his mouth to speak. This is the manner in which prophecy commences, not through human wisdom or formal instruction, but through direct encounter with the divine. The priest called Ezekiel has transformed into something new, something he never anticipated becoming. The vision granted by the Kebar waterway has altered him in ways that prove permanent. Soon enough, he will make the discovery that God has assigned work for him to accomplish, words for him to deliver, and a message for his people that will shake the very foundations upon which their faith rests. The glory of the Lord has arrived in Babylon. Nothing will retain its former state. The chariot, composed of fire, God advancing in motion. The vision refuses to depart from Ezekiel's consciousness. Days move past beside the Kebar waterway, but the images continue burning with brightness that never diminishes. The creatures possessing four faces, the wheels positioned within wheels, the throne constructed of sapphire. Each detail continues pulsing with life within his memory. Those who share his exile observe him with concern that grows stronger. Something has undergone transformation in their priest, something that causes him to stare toward the sky with eyes that see differently now. The truth arrives slowly, like the sun rising over the plains of Babylon. What Ezekiel has been granted to see is not merely a vision showing God's presence. It is the chariot belonging to God, the divine throne room rendered mobile and capable of movement. The creatures are cherubim, those mighty beings who stand guard over the places of greatest holiness. The wheels represent the means through which the Almighty travels across the earth's surface and through the heavens above. This revelation strikes with the force of lightning. In the temple located in Jerusalem, the cherubim are carved from wood and covered with gold overlay. They spread their wings, positioned over the ark, holding the covenant, motionless guardians of the space set apart as sacred. But here, beside the Kebar waterway, Ezekiel has witnessed the living reality that exists behind those carved representations. These cherubim draw breath and move and serve as those who carry the divine throne. The four faces carry significance that runs deep. The human face represents wisdom and understanding, the capacity to think and make choices and express love. The lion face speaks of strength belonging to royalty, the courage that overcomes fear and provides leadership with authority. The ox face symbolizes service offered with patience, the willingness to carry burdens and labor without voicing complaints. The eagle face soars above concerns tied to earth, perceiving with clarity from heights that are great. Together, these faces encompass the entirety of creation, humanity with the unique gift it possesses for moral choice. The wild beasts with their fierce strength and bearing of nobility, the domestic animals with their faithful service meeting human needs, the birds inhabiting the air with their freedom to soar above the earth's surface. In the cherubim, All of creation discovers its perfect representative standing before the throne of God. The wheels positioned within wheels create puzzlement for many who receive Ezekiel's account. How can one wheel contain another wheel, crossing at angles that are right? The answer lies in comprehending divine mobility. Chariots belonging to earth can only advance forward or move backward, requiring turns and curved paths to alter direction. But the chariot belonging to God can move toward any direction in an instant, without the limitations that bind vehicles of earthly origin. The eyes positioned around the outer edges of the wheels perceive everything that exists. They observe the movements of nations, the rising and falling of kings, the secret thoughts dwelling in human hearts. Nothing manages to escape their notice. When the chariot advances, it advances with perfect knowledge of all that has existed and all that will come to be. The sound produced by the wings of the cherubim creates a symphony that speaks of divine power. Similar to rushing waters, it carries the force of great rivers flowing toward the sea. Like the voice of the Almighty, it echoes with the authority that spoke the world into existence through words. When the creatures stand motionless, their wings fold in silence. But when they move into motion, their sound fills the air with presence that inspires awe. The crystal expanse positioned above the cherubim serves as the foundation supporting the throne. It stretches in the manner of a dome, transparent yet possessing strength sufficient to support the weight of divine glory. Light passes through its surface, but it also reflects and amplifies that light, generating patterns of brilliance that dance across its surface. The throne itself gives the impression of being carved from a single sapphire, that precious stone that captures the deep blue found in the sky. But this is no stone of ordinary nature. It pulses with light originating from within, as though the very essence of heaven has been crystallized into form that is solid. The throne is both beautiful and terrible in nature, inviting yet overwhelming, a seat where judgment and mercy combine as one. The figure resting upon the throne remains partially concealed, even from the prophetic vision granted to Ezekiel. The glory shines too intensely for eyes belonging to mortals to bear in direct manner. What Ezekiel perceives is the appearance of a human being, but existing surrounded by fire and rainbow light that speaks of nature that is divine. The amber radiance above and below the throne generates a halo of brilliance that transforms the complete vision. The rainbow positioned around the throne calls to remembrance God's covenant established with Noah following the great flood. It speaks of divine faithfulness, of promises maintained across generations that pass. Even within judgment, mercy continues to endure. Even in the midst of exile and destruction, hope remains alive and present. The rainbow provides Ezekiel with reminder that God remembers the covenants established with the fathers of Israel. This throne, possessing mobility, carries implications that run profound for how Ezekiel understands God. The divine presence is not restricted to the temple in Jerusalem. The Holy One of Israel can reveal himself anywhere, at any time, to anyone who requires encounter with divine glory. The theology of the chariot revolutionizes the manner in which the exiles think concerning their situation. If God possesses the capability to travel to Babylon, then the exile does not represent separation from divine presence. The Lord has arrived to be with the people during their time of greatest need. The chariot vision provides the exiles with assurance that they have not been abandoned, that the covenant relationship continues even in lands belonging to foreigners. The mobility of God's throne also suggests that divine judgment is not restricted by boundaries that are geographical. The nations that surround Israel, the powers that oppress the people of God, all fall under the watchful eyes positioned on the chariot wheels. Justice will descend like waters, reaching every corner of the earth's surface. Ezekiel begins comprehending that his vision is not merely revelation of a personal nature. It is a message intended for his entire community. The priest has transformed into a prophet, called to speak words that will challenge and bring comfort, warn, and encourage. The chariot vision represents the credential that validates his authority to speak on behalf of the Almighty. The living creatures continue their movements within his memory, never pausing in rest, always prepared to carry the divine presence wherever it requires going. The wheels positioned within, wheels turn in synchronization that is perfect, guided by the spirit of the cherubim. The throne remains steady positioned above the crystal expanse, unshaken by the movements occurring below. This is the God of Israel, not a local deity bound to a single location, but the ruler over all creation, mobile and active, present wherever divine purposes require accomplishment. The chariot vision has opened the eyes of Ezekiel to perceive the true nature of divine sovereignty. Now he must learn what God intends to accomplish with this revelation. The fire surrounding the throne burns with intensity that increases. The rainbow colors shift and change, generating new patterns of light. The cherubim spread their wings wider in extent, preparing for movement. The chariot stands ready to carry the presence of God wherever it needs to travel next. Ezekiel observes and waits, knowing that this vision represents only the beginning of the prophetic calling placed upon him. The call, consuming the scroll. The chariot vision begins fading, but the impact it carries remains. Ezekiel lies with his face pressed down beside the Kebar waterway, overwhelmed by the glory he has been permitted to witness. The ground positioned beneath him feels solid and real, a contrast that is stark to the supernatural sights that have filled his vision. His body trembles with the aftershock of encounter with the divine, every nerve alive with the memory of celestial fire. Then, words of a voice speak from the throne. The words arrive not as waves of sound traveling through air, but as direct communication that bypasses the ears and enters straight into the soul. The voice carries the authority of the one who spoke the universe into existence through words. Yet, it addresses Ezekiel with precision that is gentle. Son of man, rise up on your feet and I will speak to you. The title, Son of Man, carries meaning that runs deep. In the Hebrew language, Ben Adam emphasizes human frailty and the state of mortality. Before the God who is eternal, Ezekiel is reminded of his nature tied to earth, his limitations, his need for grace that is divine. The title will accompany him throughout the ministry he conducts as prophet, maintaining him in humility before the magnitude of the calling placed upon him. As the voice speaks, the Spirit enters into Ezekiel and sets him upright on his feet. Divine power flows through his limbs, strengthening muscles that have been weakened by overwhelming awe. The Spirit doesn't merely heal, it transforms, preparing the man who is mortal for the task that is immortal ahead. Ezekiel stands upright, no longer simply a priest in exile, but a chosen vessel for communication that is divine. The voice continues, outlining the enormity of the task positioned before him. Ezekiel is being sent to the people of Israel, to a nation that has rebelled against their God. These are not gentle, receptive hearts, waiting for words that bring comfort. They are people characterized by stubbornness, with faces that are hard and necks that are stiff, resistant to correction, and slow in their repentance. The description stings because it rings with truth. Ezekiel knows his people in ways that run deep. He has lived among them in exile, watched their reactions to conditions of hardship, listened to their complaints about the circumstances they face. Many place blame on God for their suffering, while refusing to acknowledge their own contributions to their downfall. They want comfort without any change, blessing without obedience. God warns Ezekiel that his mission will be characterized by difficulty. The people will not listen to his words because they have stopped listening to God. They will be like thorns and briars, scratching and tearing at anyone who brings messages that are unwelcome. They will be like scorpions, striking out with words that are poisonous against the messenger who challenges the assumptions that bring them comfort. But Ezekiel must speak regardless of how they respond. His job is not to guarantee results, but to deliver the message in manner that is faithful. Whether the people listen or refuse to listen, they will know that a prophet has been present among them. The responsibility for how they respond rests with them, not with the messenger. The divine commission arrives with a gift that is strange and wonderful. A hand appears before Ezekiel stretched outward from the throne. In the hand is a scroll written on both sides with words of lamentation and mourning and woe. The front and back are covered with divine writing, leaving no blank space available for human additions or modifications. The scroll contains the message Ezekiel must deliver. These are not words belonging to him, born from human wisdom or personal opinion. They are the words of the Almighty, written in script that is divine, carrying the authority of heaven itself. The words speak of judgment and sorrow, of consequences that must arrive because of rebellion that persists. Then arrives the most unusual command in all of literature concerning prophecy. God tells Ezekiel to consume the scroll, not to read it, not to commit it to memory, but to consume it completely. The prophet must take the word that is divine into his body, make it part of his very being, digest it until it becomes as natural as drawing breath. Ezekiel opens his mouth and receives the scroll. The texture is unlike any parchment belonging to earth. It dissolves upon his tongue like honey, sweet and satisfying. The sweetness surprises him. Words of judgment and lamentation should taste bitter, should cause the mouth to pucker with their harshness. Instead, they fill him with pleasure that is unexpected. The sweetness reveals a truth that runs profound about the Word of God. Even messages of judgment carry within them the sweetness of divine love. God does not punish for the sake of cruelty, but to restore and heal. The warnings are given not to destroy, but to provide opportunity for repentance. Behind every word of judgment lies a heart that breaks for children who have wandered away. As Ezekiel swallows the scroll, it becomes part of him. The words settle into his stomach, his bloodstream, his bones. He will not need to carry notes that are written or commit lengthy passages to memory. The divine message now lives within him, ready to emerge whenever God opens his mouth to speak. The consuming of the scroll represents the complete internalization of truth that is divine. Ezekiel cannot speak opinions belonging to him and call them prophecy. He cannot soften the hard edges of God's message to make it more palatable to those who will hear. The words that come from his mouth must be the words that have been planted in his heart through this consumption that is supernatural. The sweetness in his mouth contrasts sharply with the bitterness that will arrive when he begins to speak. The word of God tastes sweet to the one who receives it, but it often produces reactions that are bitter in those who hear it. The prophet experiences the joy of communication that is divine, but he also bears the burden of delivering truths that are unwelcome. God explains that Ezekiel is not being sent to foreign peoples who speak languages that are strange. He is being sent to his own people, to those who should understand Hebrew in perfect manner. The tragic irony is that foreigners might prove more receptive to divine truth than the chosen people themselves. Those who should be most eager to hear from God have become most resistant to his voice. The hardness of the hearts belonging to Israel is compared to adamant stone, harder than flint. Their foreheads are set like iron, unmovable in their determination to resist correction. They have made themselves impervious to divine influence, wrapping their hearts in layers of pride and self-justification. But God will make the forehead belonging to Ezekiel just as hard as theirs. The prophet will not be intimidated by their resistance or discouraged by their rejection. Divine strength will match human stubbornness, enabling the messenger to continue speaking truth, even when it falls on ears that are deaf. The call is complete. Ezekiel has seen the glory, heard the voice, consumed the scroll. He is no longer just a priest in exile. He is a prophet of the Most High, commissioned to speak words that are divine to people who are rebellious. The taste of honey still lingers upon his tongue, but the bitter work of prophecy stretches before him. The Spirit lifts him up and takes him away from the place of vision. He returns to his people by the Kebar waterway, but he is changed. The scroll lives within him now, its words ready to emerge at the time that is proper. He sits among the exiles for 7 days, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the calling placed upon him, processing the transformation that has taken place in his life. The other exiles notice the change in him. Something burns in his eyes that was not there before. His silence carries weight, as though he is holding back words that could shake the earth. They do not yet know that their priest has transformed into a prophet, that the word of the Lord has discovered a new voice among them. The 7 days of silence prepare Ezekiel for the work ahead. Like a woman in labor, he carries the word that is divine within him, waiting for the moment of delivery. The scroll has been consumed, its contents absorbed into his very being. Soon, very soon, he will begin to speak the words that will challenge everything his people believe about their past, their present, and their future. The call is complete, but the mission has just begun. The mute prophet, isolation and silence. 7 days move past in heavy silence. Ezekiel sits among those who share his exile by the Kebar waterway, but he might as well be on another planet. The scroll he has consumed burns within him like a coal in his chest, its words pressing against his ribs, demanding release. Yet when he opens his mouth to speak, no words arrive. The silence is not natural. It wraps around his tongue like bonds that are invisible, sealing his lips with force that is supernatural. God has rendered him mute, cutting off the normal flow of conversation that once connected him to his community. The priest, who used to offer counsel and comfort, now sits locked in wordless isolation. The muteness serves a purpose that is divine. In the ancient world, prophets are expected to speak constantly, to offer words of wisdom and guidance for every situation. But the silence belonging to Ezekiel becomes its own form of prophecy, a living symbol of the spiritual deafness that has overtaken his people. Just as they have stopped listening to God, he has stopped speaking to them. The exiles watch him with concern that grows. They approach with questions about family matters, disputes over property, interpretations of the law. Ezekiel looks at them with eyes that burn with knowledge that is unspoken, but his mouth remains sealed. The frustration builds on both sides. They need his guidance, and he needs to speak, but the restraint that is divine holds firm. This forced silence teaches Ezekiel about the weight of words. Every priest and teacher takes speaking for granted, using words freely to instruct and correct and encourage. But when speech is taken away, the value of each word becomes precious. Ezekiel learns to treasure the moments when God will open his mouth, knowing that words of prophecy are not casual conversation, but communication that is sacred. The isolation goes deeper than mere muteness. Ezekiel finds himself separated from the normal rhythms of community life. He cannot participate in the discussions that fill the evening hours, cannot share in the jokes and stories that help the exiles cope with their displacement. He becomes a living embodiment of the separation between God and his people. Yet the silence is not complete. When God has specific messages to deliver, the invisible bonds around the tongue of Ezekiel dissolve temporarily. His voice returns with clarity that is startling, carrying words that seem to arrive from another realm. The contrast between silence and speech becomes dramatic when the prophet speaks. Everyone listens because they know his words are rare and therefore significant. The pattern of selective muteness creates a dynamic that is powerful. The neighbors of Ezekiel learn to pay attention to the signs that indicate when he is about to speak. His body language changes. His eyes focus with intensity like a laser. His breathing deepens. These moments of communication that is divine become events that draw crowds as people gather to hear what the silent prophet will say. But the messages that break through the silence are not ones that bring comfort. They speak of judgment and destruction, of consequences that must arrive because of rebellion that persists. The exiles who have been hoping for words of comfort and reassurance find themselves confronted with harsh truths about their spiritual condition. Some wish the prophet would return to silence. The muteness also serves to authenticate the prophetic ministry belonging to Ezekiel. Anyone can make claims to speak for God, but few can demonstrate control over their own speech that is supernatural. The obvious struggle between his desire to communicate and his inability to speak convinces the exiles that something beyond human willpower is at work in their midst. Between the moments of speech that is prophetic, Ezekiel begins to develop a new form of communication. He turns to actions that are dramatic, using his body and simple props to convey messages that are divine. The silent prophet becomes a master of prophecy that is visual, creating performances that are symbolic and speak louder than words ever could. His first major performance shocks the community of exiles. Ezekiel takes a large tablet made of clay and carefully sketches the outline of Jerusalem on its surface. He draws the city walls, the gates, the major buildings, creating a map that is recognizable of their beloved homeland. The exiles gather around, curious about this artistic project from their normally silent priest. Then Ezekiel begins to build. He constructs miniature siege works around the clay Jerusalem, complete with ramps and battering rams and towers. He positions plates made of iron between himself and the city, creating a wall of separation. The performance becomes clear. This is not art, but prophecy. The silent prophet is showing them what will happen to Jerusalem. The visual impact is devastating. The exiles can see their city under attack, surrounded by forces belonging to the enemy, cut off from help. The iron plate between Ezekiel and the city represents the separation between God and Jerusalem, the protection that is divine that has been withdrawn. The face of the prophet set like flint against the model city shows the determination of judgment that is divine. But the performance is not finished. Ezekiel lies down on his left side, next to the model siege, and remains there. Day after day, he maintains this position, bearing the weight that is symbolic of the sin belonging to Israel. The sight becomes a daily reminder to the exiles of the guilt belonging to their nation and the consequences that must follow. The physical discomfort of maintaining this position for extended periods becomes part of the message. The body of Ezekiel aches with the burden that is symbolic he carries, just as the heart of God aches with the weight of the rebellion belonging to his people. The suffering of the prophet becomes a window into sorrow that is divine, showing the exiles how their sin affects the heart of God. The performance continues for days, then weeks. Ezekiel becomes a living calendar, marking time through his actions that are prophetic. The exiles cannot ignore him. He is right there in their midst, silently proclaiming judgment through his body position. The prophecy that is visual penetrates their consciousness in ways that words might not. Other actions that are symbolic follow. Ezekiel carefully measures out small portions of food and water, demonstrating the rationing that will arrive during the siege of Jerusalem. He shaves his head with a sword, dividing the hair into 3 parts to show the fate of the inhabitants of the city. Each action carries layers of meaning, creating a drama that is theological and complex, performed in the settlement beside the Kebar waterway. The combination of muteness that is supernatural and prophecy that is dramatic creates a style of prophecy that is unique. Ezekiel becomes known not just for what he says during his brief moments of speech, but for what he does during his long periods of silence. His body becomes a canvas on which messages that are divine are painted, his daily life transformed into prophecy that is ongoing. The community of exiles finds themselves watching their silent priest with new eyes. They learn to read the signs of his actions that are prophetic, to interpret the symbols he creates, to understand the messages he communicates without words. The muteness intended to isolate him actually draws them closer as they struggle to comprehend his proclamations that are wordless. As the weeks move past, the silence belonging to Ezekiel becomes a central feature of life in exile. The community organizes itself around his performances that are prophetic, gathering to witness each new development in the action that is symbolic. The mute prophet has become their most important teacher. Even though he rarely speaks, his silence carries more weight than the words of most people. The control over his speech, that is supernatural, serves as a constant reminder that Ezekiel is not operating under his own power. The hand that is divine that seals his lips also guides his actions, ensuring that every gesture carries authority that is prophetic and authentic. The exiles cannot dismiss him as merely disturbed or seeking attention. The element that is supernatural is too obvious to ignore. The isolation created by his muteness also purifies the message belonging to Ezekiel. Without the ability to engage in casual conversation, he cannot dilute the word that is divine with opinion that is human. When he speaks, the words carry the force that is concentrated of heaven, undiluted by pleasantries that are social or commentary that is personal. The silence creates space for the voice that is divine to emerge with clarity that is startling. The mute prophet has become a parable that is living, his very existence a message about the communication that is broken between God and his people. The exiles who watch him struggle with silence that is supernatural are forced to confront their own deafness that is spiritual. The priest who cannot speak becomes a mirror, reflecting their own inability to hear. The siege enacted, building the model of Jerusalem. The clay tablet bearing the outline of Jerusalem sits in the center of the exile settlement like a battlefield that is miniature. Ezekiel has etched every detail with precision that is careful. The mount where the temple stands, the palace, the residential quarters, the gates that connect the city to the world beyond. The exiles gather around this model of their beloved city, drawn by nostalgia and curiosity. But the work belonging to Ezekiel is far from finished. The silent prophet begins to construct siege works around the clay Jerusalem, his hands moving with the skill that is practiced of someone who has witnessed actual warfare. He builds ramps made of earth leading up to the walls, showing how armies that are attacking gain access to cities that are fortified. The engines for siege that are miniature take shape under his craftsmanship that is careful. Plates made of iron stand between Ezekiel and the model city, creating a wall of separation that chills the hearts of exiles who are watching. They understand the symbolism. God has turned his face away from Jerusalem, withdrawing the protection that is divine that once made the city impregnable. The barrier made of iron represents the hardening of judgment that is divine, the point at which mercy gives way to justice. The face of the prophet, set like flint toward the besieged city, mirrors the determination that is divine to carry out judgment. There is no softness in his expression, no hint of wavering or doubt. The exiles see in his features the resolve that is inflexible of heaven itself, the certainty that what has been decreed will surely come to pass. Then arrives the element that is most dramatic of the performance. Ezekiel lies down on his left side beside the siege model and remains there. Day after day, he maintains this position, bearing the weight that is symbolic of the sin belonging to Israel. The sight becomes a daily reminder to the exiles of the guilt belonging to their nation and the price that must be paid. The discomfort that is physical is immediately apparent. Human bodies are not designed to remain in positions that are fixed for extended periods. The muscles of Ezekiel cramp, his joints ache, his skin develops sores from pressure. The exiles watching see their priest-prophet suffering, and they begin to understand that his pain represents something larger than hardship that is personal. God explains the meaning through the few words Ezekiel is permitted to speak. Each day that he lies on his left side represents a year of the sin belonging to Israel, 390 days total, stretching back through centuries of rebellion and idolatry. The guilt belonging to the northern kingdom is being measured out in increments that are daily, calculated with precision that is divine. The number 390 carries weight that is historical, It encompasses the period from the establishment of the northern kingdom through its destruction by the Assyrians, plus the years of rebellion that is continued that followed. Every day of the suffering that is physical, belonging to Ezekiel, corresponds to a year of unfaithfulness that is spiritual by the people of Israel. The exiles watch in fascination and horror as their priest continues the performance week after week. His dedication to the action that is prophetic convinces them that something beyond human willpower is at work. No one would voluntarily endure such discomfort for such an extended period without compulsion that is divine. The impact that is visual penetrates their consciousness in ways that words alone never could. They see their sin that is national embodied in the suffering belonging to Ezekiel, their guilt that is collective made personal through his pain that is physical. The concept that is abstract of judgment that is divine becomes concrete and immediate through the actions of the prophet. After 390 days on his left side, Ezekiel switches to his right side for another 40 days. This represents the sin of the southern kingdom of Judah, the nation that includes Jerusalem and the temple. The number 40 recalls the wandering in the wilderness when an entire generation died because of unbelief. Now Judah faces a consequence that is similar for unfaithfulness that is similar. The rationing of food that accompanies the performance of the siege adds another layer of realism. Ezekiel carefully measures out portions that are small of bread and water, demonstrating the starvation that will accompany the siege of Jerusalem. He eats the rations that are meager publicly, showing the exiles exactly what their relatives in Jerusalem will soon experience. The recipe for the bread itself carries meaning that is symbolic. Ezekiel mixes wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, grains that would never be combined under circumstances that are normal. This mixture represents the desperation of conditions during siege, when people eat anything available to stay alive. The combination that is unusual suggests that sources of food that are normal have been exhausted. The rationing of water is equally dramatic. Ezekiel measures out exactly 1/6 of a hin per day, barely enough to survive. He drinks this amount that is small with hands that tremble, showing the fear and anxiety that accompany thirst that is extreme. The exiles watch their priest slowly weakening, and they begin to understand what awaits their city that is beloved. The fuel for cooking presents another symbol that is shocking. God initially commands Ezekiel to bake his bread, using waste that is human as fuel, a practice that would render the food unclean ceremonially. The command strikes at the heart of the identity belonging to Ezekiel as a priest. He has spent his life maintaining purity that is ritual, and now he is asked to violate it completely. The response belonging to Ezekiel that is anguished reveals the depth of his horror. He pleads with God, explaining that he has never defiled himself with food that is unclean, that his mouth has never been contaminated by anything forbidden. The request strikes at the core of his identity that is religious, challenging everything he has been taught about holiness and purity. The response from God shows mercy that is divine within judgment. The command is modified. Ezekiel may use dung belonging to cows instead of waste that is human, a fuel source that is unpleasant but not defiling ceremonially. The change demonstrates that judgment that is divine can be tempered with compassion even in the midst of discipline that is necessary. The fuel for cooking symbolizes the defilement that will arrive to Jerusalem during the siege. The city that is holy will be forced to compromise its purity in order to survive. The people who pride themselves on cleanliness that is ritual will find themselves eating food that is unclean, using whatever fuel they can find, abandoning their standards that are ceremonial in the face of need that is desperate. The entire performance creates a theater that is prophetic, that dominates the exile settlement. Ezekiel becomes the figure that is central, around which community life revolves. People organize their schedules that are daily around his actions, gathering to witness each new development in the siege that is symbolic. The impact that is psychological on the exiles is profound. They can no longer maintain illusions that are comfortable about the security belonging to Jerusalem. The model siege confronts them daily with the reality of the vulnerability belonging to their city. They begin to understand that their exile is not displacement that is temporary, but part of a judgment that is divine and larger. Some exiles respond with anger, accusing Ezekiel of pessimism and disloyalty. They argue that God would never allow Jerusalem to fall, that the presence of the temple guarantees protection that is divine. But the commitment that is unwavering of the prophet to his performance, that is prophetic, slowly wears down their objections. Others begin to see the truth in the actions that are symbolic belonging to Ezekiel. They remember the warnings given by prophets that came earlier, the signs of decay they witnessed before their own exile. The model siege helps them understand that their displacement that is personal is part of a pattern that is larger of judgment that is divine. The performance also serves as a form of intercession. Ezekiel literally bears the weight of the sin belonging to his people, carrying their guilt in his own body. His suffering becomes a form of prayer, a plea that is physical for mercy that is divine in the midst of judgment. The pain of the prophet represents the heart of God, breaking under the weight of rebellion that is human. As the months move past, the siege model becomes a landmark in the exile settlement. Visitors from communities that are other arrive to witness the prophet that is strange, who lies beside his city made of clay, acting out the fate of Jerusalem. The performance becomes famous throughout the population that is in exile, spreading the message belonging to Ezekiel far beyond his neighbors that are immediate. The model siege also serves as a calendar marking time through action that is prophetic. The exiles measure their own experiences against the progress of the siege that is symbolic belonging to Ezekiel. They begin to see their stories that are individual, as part of a narrative that is larger, of judgment and restoration that is divine. The toll that is physical on Ezekiel becomes increasingly apparent as the performance continues. His body weakens under the strain of maintaining positions that are unnatural for extended periods. Yet, he persists, driven by compulsion that is divine, that overrides comfort that is human. The performance of the siege becomes a test of endurance that mirrors the endurance that is spiritual required of his people. The Jerusalem that is a model sits at the center of it all, a constant reminder of what is at stake. The city made of clay that once represented home and security now symbolizes vulnerability and judgment. The exiles cannot look at it without thinking of their relatives still living within those walls, unaware of the catastrophe approaching their gates. The siege enacted becomes more than prophecy, it becomes preparation. The exiles who witness the performance belonging to Ezekiel will be ready when news arrives from Jerusalem. They will understand that the fall of the city is not abandonment that is divine, but justice that is divine, not the end of hope, but the beginning of a chapter that is new in their relationship with God. But for now, they continue their deafness that is willful, their blindness that is determined to truth that is prophetic. The model siege sits in their midst like a bomb that measures time, counting down the days until their denial becomes impossible to maintain. The prophet who warned them lies exhausted beside his Jerusalem made of clay, faithful to his calling despite their response that is faithless. Within the shadowy confines of their concealed chamber, they experience freedom to pursue spiritual alternatives that public life would never permit. Their hushed dialogues expose the theological reasoning that drives their behavior. They share with one another the belief that the Lord has abandoned the territory, that the God worshipped by their ancestors no longer observes or shows concern for his followers. Since the traditional deity has removed his protection, they conclude, perhaps alternative gods might respond more favorably to what they need. The inner transformation necessary for such conduct shows just how far their spiritual wandering has progressed. These same men previously stood within the temple courtyards, presenting acceptable offerings, instructing the community about remaining faithful to the covenant, upholding the customs handed down through Moses and David. Yet now they gather in shadows, lighting incense before painted creatures upon concealed surfaces. The voice of God resonates with profound sadness as he clarifies the meaning of what Ezekiel observes. This secret worship of idols signifies something beyond personal defiance. It exposes the total collapse of spiritual guidance throughout Jerusalem. The very individuals who ought to be protecting the faith in one God have transformed into its chief violators. The secretive character of their practices adds yet another dimension of moral decay to their transgression. They project public images of proper worship while engaging in private paganism. The duplicity required demands perpetual dishonesty, a lifestyle that erodes the spirit and eliminates genuine connection with the divine. However, the survey of Jerusalem's moral decay has not reached its conclusion. God directs Ezekiel toward the northern gate of the temple, where yet another disturbing tableau presents itself. Women sit there, creating woven works for Asherah, the fertility goddess of Canaan. These aren't foreign guests or new believers. They are Israel's daughters, women who should be nurturing their offspring in reverence of the Lord. The veneration of Asherah embodies a fundamental abandonment of biblical principles regarding sexuality and family structure. This deity offers fertility and abundance through ritualized prostitution and sexual activities that transform intimate affection into religious transaction. The women weaving her decorative cloths are making preparations for rituals that will compromise their marriages and wound their spirits. The prophet observes with mounting dread as the organized character of Jerusalem's apostasy grows evident. This represents not scattered rebellion or periodic backsliding. It constitutes deliberate, widespread abandonment of covenant relationship with God. Every stratum of society, from spiritual authorities to common women, has discovered methods to incorporate pagan practices into daily existence. The concluding scene in this examination of corruption unfolds in the temple's inner court itself, the most sanctified location in all of Israel's worship. 25 men position themselves between the portico and the altar, their backs facing away from the Holy of Holies, where divine presence should reside. Rather than orienting toward the divine presence, they bow themselves eastward, paying homage to the ascending sun. These sun worshippers embody the complete reversal of appropriate worship. Israel's God fashioned the sun as a servant for human benefit, a provider of illumination and heat that functions according to divine instruction. Yet these men have inverted the proper order, prostrating themselves before the created object while disregarding the Creator who brought it into being. The count of 25 could signify the entire complement of priestly divisions, with one exception, indicating that virtually the complete priesthood has forsaken proper worship. These are the individuals charged with conducting the daily offerings, with teaching the population about divine holiness, with maintaining the customs that link Israel to their covenant inheritance. Their eastern focus, while positioned in the temple, demonstrates the extent of their bewilderment. They have imported Babylonian and Persian spiritual practices into the very center of Jewish devotion, blending foreign components with traditional expressions until the outcome barely resembles the faith of their forefathers. The spectacle fills God with such disgust that the divine voice quivers with fury. These priests, who should be creating a bridge between heaven and earth, have transformed into barriers to authentic worship. They obstruct the very connection they were appointed to enable, converting the temple into a bazaar of competing spiritual choices. The visions of moral corruption clarify why Jerusalem's annihilation has become unavoidable. The city's external adversaries serve merely as tools of judgment for internal spiritual deterioration that has advanced to fatal stages. When the spiritual leaders themselves have deserted their mission, when hidden rooms shelter forbidden practices, when women craft garments for foreign deities, When priests prostrate themselves before the sun in God's own dwelling, what possibility exists for divine compassion? Ezekiel's priestly spirit fractures as he witnesses the methodical profaning of everything he considers sacred. The temple that should serve as the focal point of pure devotion has degenerated into a marketplace of rival religions. The leaders who should be defending spiritual truth have become its principal corruptors. The examination ends with divine explanation that makes judgment's necessity clear. God has been expelled from his own dwelling by the detestable practices of his own followers. The presence that should inhabit the Holy of Holies has been compelled to find alternative lodging. When God's own people render his house unlivable, judgment transforms from cruelty into purification. The vision dissolves, and Ezekiel discovers himself returned to Babylon, seated among the elders who have observed his supernatural relocation. Their expressions mirror the astonishment of seeing their former priest seized by prophetic transport, validating that something transcending normal human experience has transpired. Now Ezekiel must articulate what he has witnessed, must portray the hidden corruptions that render Jerusalem's destruction necessary. The siege demonstration beside the Kebar River symbolizes external judgment. Yet these visions uncover the internal deterioration that makes such judgment both inevitable and righteous, the withdrawal of God's glory. Ichabod. The vision of corruption throughout Jerusalem has exposed why judgment must arrive. However, God possesses one additional devastating reality to reveal to Ezekiel. The prophet has observed the external danger represented through his siege demonstration, witnessed the internal decay corrupting the temple itself. Now he must observe the most heartbreaking result of all, the withdrawal of divine glory from the sacred city. The vision commences where the earlier one concluded, with Ezekiel positioned in the temple complex, observing the abominations that have forced God from his residence. Yet now his focus is pulled skyward to the throne chamber of heaven that hovers suspended above the cherubim in the inner court. The identical divine chariot he encountered by the Kebar River has arrived in Jerusalem. The cherubim stand prepared beside the throne, their four countenances oriented in all directions. Their wings extended for instantaneous departure. The wheels, positioned within wheels, rest upon the temple pavement. Their circular edges filled with eyes that have observed excessive corruption, excessive betrayal, excessive systematic rejection of divine affection. The crystalline platform extends above them, supporting the sapphire throne, where divine glory radiates with diminished brilliance. God summons a man dressed in linen, a figure who appears to be a messenger of mercy amid judgment. This messenger receives a sacred assignment to mark the foreheads of those throughout Jerusalem who mourn over the abominations occurring in the city. These righteous few will be protected in the approaching destruction, shielded by divine seal from the judgment about to descend. The man in linen travels through Jerusalem's pathways with supernatural velocity, searching for hearts that still fracture over spiritual corruption. He discovers precious few. Most of the city's residents have either embraced the idolatry or learned to accept it. The faithful remnant proves devastatingly small, a handful of spirits who still recall what genuine worship should resemble. As the marking of the righteous continues, God summons 6 additional angels, men carrying instruments of destruction in their grasp. These represent the agents of divine judgment, authorized to carry out the sentence that Jerusalem's transgressions have rendered inevitable. They stand prepared to commence their grim assignment, awaiting only the signal to advance. The command arrives with terrible finality. The angels of destruction receive instruction to move through the city and strike down all who do not possess the protective mark upon their forehead. They must demonstrate no compassion, to exempt neither elderly nor youth, neither men nor women nor children. The judgment will be all-encompassing, eliminating the corrupt generation that has defiled God's residence. However, they must commence at the temple itself, with the elders who have corrupted their sacred responsibility, the 70 men who offered incense to painted idols, the 25 priests who venerated the sun in God's dwelling. These spiritual authorities will be the initial casualties. The judgment commences where the corruption originated, with those who should have possessed greater understanding. Ezekiel observes in horror as the angels initiate their work. Bodies collapse in the temple courtyards, the sacred stone flooring stained with blood of those who desecrated it through their idolatry. The spectacle overwhelms the prophet. He collapses on his face, crying out in torment for his people. "Sovereign Lord," he implores, "are you planning to annihilate the complete remnant of Israel in this outpouring of your anger upon Jerusalem?" The question bears the burden of covenant history, the remembrance of divine commitments made to Abraham and David. Can God's judgment be so thorough that no hope survives for the future? The divine answer discloses the magnitude of Jerusalem's corruption. The guilt of Israel and Judah stands immense. The territory saturated with bloodshed, the city distorted by injustice. The population has persuaded themselves that God has abandoned the territory, that he no longer observes their conduct or concerns himself with their decisions. This theology of divine absence has liberated them to pursue whatever course serves their immediate advantage. As the judgment advances in the vision, something even more catastrophic begins to develop. The glory of the Lord initiates movement from its customary dwelling location in the Holy of Holies. For centuries, the divine presence has remained constant at this position, residing between the cherubim above the Ark of the Covenant. Even during the people's wandering, God remained in his dwelling. However, now the glory begins to ascend. Gradually, unwillingly, with evident sorrow, the divine presence elevates from the mercy seat where it has resided since the temple's consecration. The movement unfolds gradually, as though God himself wrestles with the choice to abandon his earthly residence. The cherubim spread their wings and ascend with the divine glory. The wheels commence their rotation, prepared to transport the throne wherever divine intentions demand. The sound of their wings saturates the temple courtyards like rushing water, like the voice of the Almighty pronouncing judgment. Every eye capable of seeing, every ear able to hear, witnesses this moment of ultimate abandonment. The glory pauses at the temple's threshold, suspended between the inner court and the external world. This hesitation communicates divine reluctance of a God who finds no pleasure in judgment, but discovers it necessary when all alternative options have been depleted. The pause provides one final moment for repentance, one ultimate opportunity for the city to recognize its transgressions and return to covenant faithfulness. However, no such repentance materializes. The priests persist in their sun veneration. The women continue their weaving for Asherah. The elders maintain their secret idolatry. The pause at the threshold exposes the hardness of hearts that have become resistant to divine entreaty. The city has selected its trajectory and will not reverse course. Gradually, with infinite sorrow, the glory of the Lord advances beyond the temple threshold. The divine presence that has resided in Jerusalem for 4 centuries initiates its departure from the sacred city. The cherubim transport the throne eastward, away from the Temple Mount, away from the city of David, away from the people who have rejected their covenant calling. The glory arrives to rest upon the mountain east of the city, the Mount of Olives that overlooks Jerusalem from across the Kidron Valley. From this elevated vantage point, the divine presence gazes back at the city that was formerly called the joy of the entire earth. The view encompasses the complete urban panorama, the temple with its corrupted worship, the palace with its unjust authorities, the neighborhoods where violence and idolatry have become normalized. The symbolism of this final resting location carries prophetic significance. The Mount of Olives represents separation and judgment, the location where divine presence withdraws to observe rather than participate. The eastward movement recalls the direction of exile, the route that leads away from the promised land toward foreign territories. Yet even in this moment of departure, hope remains embedded in the divine action. The glory does not vanish entirely. It pauses on the mountain, maintaining visual connection with the beloved city. This suggests that the separation, though genuine and necessary, is not necessarily permanent. The God who departs in judgment may return in mercy when the conditions for restoration are fulfilled. The departure of divine glory transforms Jerusalem's status completely. The city that formerly claimed divine protection now stands exposed before its adversaries. The temple that once guaranteed God's presence now sits vacant, a magnificent shell containing nothing except human corruption. The people who once boasted of their special relationship with God now confront the future without divine advocacy. This moment fulfills the ancient warning spoken when the ark was seized by the Philistines. Ichabod, meaning the glory, has departed from Israel. What transpired temporarily in the days of Eli now occurs permanently in the days of Ezekiel. The glory that defined Israel's identity as God's chosen people has abandoned them to confront the consequences of their choices. The vision concludes with the divine chariot vanishing from view, transported by the cherubim beyond the horizon toward other territories, other peoples, other purposes. The wheels within wheels roll into the distance, their eyes turning away from Jerusalem to observe new territories where divine glory might discover more suitable dwelling locations. Ezekiel discovers himself returned to Babylon, overwhelmed by what he has witnessed. The departure of God's glory represents the conclusion of an era, the ending of the period when divine presence could be localized in a single structure in a specific city. The mobile throne he initially saw by the Kebar River has demonstrated its significance. God is not confined to any earthly location, but moves according to divine purposes. The prophet now comprehends why his siege demonstration will prove accurate. Jerusalem's destruction represents not merely military conquest, but divine abandonment. The city will collapse because the presence that once shielded it has withdrawn. The temple will burn because the glory that once saturated it has departed. The people will be dispersed because the God who once gathered them has turned away. Yet embedded in this vision of departure exists the seed of future hope. The identical glory that can leave Jerusalem can also return to it. The mobile throne that transports divine presence away can someday transport it back. The God who judges in righteousness may also restore in mercy when his people are prepared to receive him appropriately. The departure of glory marks the conclusion of one chapter in the relationship between God and his people. However, it also opens the possibility for a new chapter, one in which divine presence might dwell among them in ways they have never experienced previously. The empty temple mourns the glory that has departed, yet it also waits for the glory that may yet return. The judgment on the city, destruction foretold, the vision of departing glory fades, leaving Ezekiel isolated with the burden of divine revelation. The prophet sits in his residence in Babylon, surrounded by the elders who have witnessed his supernatural transport to Jerusalem. Their faces reflect confusion and fear as they process what they have observed. Their former priest seized by prophetic ecstasy, his body present, yet his spirit clearly elsewhere. Now arrives the most difficult part of prophetic ministry. Ezekiel must translate divine vision into human language, must discover words to convey the indescribable reality of God's judgment upon the holy city. The images blaze in his memory. The departing cherubim, the vacant throne room, the glory of the Lord withdrawing from its ancient residence. The word of the Lord reaches Ezekiel with crystalline clarity. Jerusalem's destruction will be thorough and terrible, executed through three primary instruments of divine wrath. Sword, famine, and pestilence will devastate the city until its population is decimated and its proud walls lie in ruins. The sword signifies military conquest, the gleaming bronze weapons of Babylonian soldiers who will penetrate Jerusalem's defenses. These warriors will demonstrate no compassion to age or gender, cutting down elderly men who remember the city's glory days alongside young children who have never known foreign occupation. The streets will flow red with blood as the defenders collapse before superior forces. However, the sword alone will not accomplish Jerusalem's destruction. Famine will precede the final assault, weakening the city's defenders through gradual starvation. The siege that Ezekiel has enacted beside the Kebar River will create conditions of desperate hunger within Jerusalem's walls. Mothers will fight their neighbors for fragments of bread. Fathers will observe their children waste away from malnutrition. The famine will force Jerusalem's inhabitants to make choices that violate their deepest religious convictions. They will consume unclean animals, drink contaminated water, consume anything that might sustain life for another day. The dietary laws that have defined Jewish identity for centuries will crumble under the pressure of survival necessity. Cannibalism will emerge as the ultimate horror of siege conditions. Parents will be driven to consume their own children, while children will feed upon the flesh of their parents. The bonds that hold families together will fracture under pressure that exceeds human endurance. The city that once hosted joyful wedding feasts will witness scenes of unspeakable desperation. Pestilence will complete the trinity of destruction, spreading disease through the weakened population. The bodies that accumulate in Jerusalem's streets will become breeding grounds for plague that spreads faster than burial details can work. Disease will accomplish what sword and famine initiated, carrying off survivors who managed to avoid the other instruments of judgment. The mathematical precision of divine judgment emerges as God explains the proportions of destruction awaiting Jerusalem. 1/3 of the population will die from famine and pestilence within the city walls. Another third will fall by the sword during the siege and final assault. The remaining third will be scattered among the nations. However, even these survivors will face pursuit by divine wrath. These fractions reveal the comprehensive nature of judgment that leaves no room for escape through human planning or effort. The destruction will be so thorough that Jerusalem's suffering will become a cautionary tale among surrounding nations. Visitors will point to the ruined city as evidence of what transpires when people reject their covenant calling. The timing of this judgment has been determined by divine patience that has reached its limits. For generations, God has sent prophets to warn Jerusalem about the consequences of persistent rebellion. Jeremiah currently walks the city's streets, pleading with kings and commoners to repent before disaster strikes. However, the warnings fall on deaf ears, hardened by prosperity and pride. The catalogue of Jerusalem's sins reveals why such severe judgment has become necessary. The city is saturated with violence, its rulers corrupt, its judges accepting bribes, its priests teaching false doctrine. Innocent blood has been shed in the streets while the guilty escape punishment. The poor are oppressed, while the wealthy feast in luxury. Sexual immorality has become commonplace, with shrine prostitution conducted in the shadow of the temple itself. Marriages are broken by adultery that faces no social consequences. Children are sacrificed to foreign gods in the valley of Hinnom, their screams mixing with the smoke that ascends from Molech's fires. The economic system has become a mechanism for exploitation rather than mutual support. Merchants use false weights and measures, charging the poor excessive prices for basic necessities. Landlords evict widows from their homes, while moneylenders charge interest rates that trap families in permanent debt. Religious corruption permeates every aspect of worship. The priests offer sacrifices while their hearts serve other gods. The prophets speak smooth words that tickle ears while avoiding hard truths that might produce repentance. The temple services continue with empty ritual while the spiritual heart of the nation rots away. Political leadership has abandoned any pretense of serving divine purposes. Kings make alliances with pagan nations, adopting their customs and worshipping their gods. Military commanders rely on foreign mercenaries rather than trusting in divine protection. Diplomatic marriages bring foreign wives who establish shrines to their native deities. The social fabric has torn apart under the burden of systematic injustice. Neighbors no longer trust each other. Families split along lines of competing loyalties. Communities fragment into hostile factions. The unity that once made Israel strong has dissolved into chaos that makes the nation vulnerable to external enemies. Divine patience has a breaking point, and Jerusalem has pushed beyond it. The warnings given through earlier prophets have been ignored. The opportunities for repentance have been squandered. The time for mercy has passed. Justice demands satisfaction for centuries of accumulated rebellion. The destruction will serve multiple purposes in divine economy. It will punish the guilty for their persistent rebellion against covenant obligations. It will vindicate divine holiness that has been mocked by systematic idolatry. It will remove the corrupted leadership that has led the people astray. However, judgment also serves redemptive purposes that extend beyond punishment. The destruction of Jerusalem will shatter the illusions that have prevented genuine repentance. When the temple burns and the city falls, the people will be forced to confront the reality of their spiritual condition without the buffers that have protected them from truth. The scattering of survivors among the nations will accomplish what centuries of preaching could not achieve. Living as exiles in foreign lands, surrounded by alien customs and languages, the remnant will rediscover the value of their covenant heritage. Separation from the promised land will teach them to appreciate what they took for granted while living there. The judgment will also serve as testimony to watching nations about the reality of divine justice. When Jerusalem falls exactly as the prophets predicted, surrounding peoples will be forced to acknowledge that Israel's God is not merely a local deity, but the ruler of all nations. The destruction will become evangelism to the pagan world. The three instruments of judgment, sword, famine, and pestilence, represent divine sovereignty over every aspect of human existence. Military might cannot protect against God's wrath. Abundant harvests cannot prevent divinely decreed famine. Medical knowledge cannot cure diseases sent from heaven. The judgment will demonstrate that no human institution can stand against divine purpose. Yet, even in the midst of these terrible pronouncements, hints of future hope emerge. The remnant that survives the scattering will carry the seeds of national restoration. The destruction that seems complete will not be final. The God who judges in righteousness will also restore in mercy when the conditions for renewal are met. The judgment on Jerusalem represents both ending and beginning, the conclusion of one era in the relationship between God and his people, and the preparation for a new era that will emerge from the ashes of the old. The destruction foretold will indeed come to pass, but it will not have the final word in Israel's story. Prophecy against the nations. Surrounding powers condemned. The judgment pronounced against Jerusalem reverberates beyond the borders of Israel, extending to the nations that surround God's people. Ezekiel's prophetic vision expands like ripples from a stone cast into still water, encompassing the entire regional political landscape. The identical divine justice that will devastate the holy city will also reach the pagan kingdoms that have oppressed, exploited, and corrupted Israel. The catalogue of condemned nations reads like a geographic survey of the ancient Near East. Each name carries historical weight, representing centuries of conflict, alliance, betrayal, and rivalry. These are not distant kingdoms unknown to Israel, but immediate neighbors whose actions have directly affected the covenant people's relationship with their God. Ammon stands first in the line of judgment. That nation descended from Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughter. The Ammonites have celebrated every misfortune that has befallen Israel, clapping their hands with glee when the temple was profaned, stamping their feet with joy when the land was desolated, rejoicing with malicious hearts when the people went into exile. Their celebration of Israel's suffering reveals hearts that have hardened beyond redemption. Instead of learning from their neighbors' discipline, the Ammonites have interpreted divine judgment as evidence of their own superiority. They failed to understand that the identical God who judges Israel also watches their own behavior with eyes that see everything. Divine justice will transform Ammon's eastern location into a highway for nomadic peoples who will overrun their settled cities. The Bedouins will pitch their tents where Ammonite palaces once stood, their camels grazing in fields that once produced abundant harvests. The nation that mocked Israel's exile will experience their own displacement at the hands of desert wanderers. Moab joins Ammon in the dock of divine judgment, another descendant of Lot's compromised family line. The Moabites have compounded their ancestors' shame by declaring that Judah is just like all the other nations, nothing special, no different from the kingdoms that surround them. This theological assault strikes at the heart of Israel's covenant identity. The Moabite denial of Israel's unique relationship with God represents more than political rhetoric. It constitutes spiritual blindness that refuses to acknowledge divine election. By reducing God's chosen people to the level of ordinary nations, Moab reveals their inability to discern the sacred from the secular, the holy from the common. Divine response will strip away Moab's own sense of national superiority. Their mountain fortresses will crumble. Their proud cities will fall to invading armies. Their people will learn the meaning of displacement and defeat. The nation that denied Israel's uniqueness will discover their own vulnerability before the God who judges all peoples. Edom faces particularly severe judgment because their sin carries the burden of family betrayal. These descendants of Esau should have remembered their kinship with the children of Jacob, should have shown mercy to their relatives in times of distress. Instead, they took vengeance with malicious hearts, pursuing ancient grudges with relentless hatred. They stood by and watched when Jerusalem fell, offering no help to their kinsmen in their hour of greatest need. Worse than mere indifference, they actively participated in the city's destruction, cutting off escape routes for fleeing refugees, handing over survivors to their enemies. Their betrayal stings with the particular pain that comes from family treachery. Divine justice will pursue Edom with the identical, relentless hatred they showed toward their brothers. The rocky strongholds that made them feel secure will become tombs for their warriors. The trade routes that brought them wealth will carry armies bent on their destruction. The nation that showed no mercy will receive none in return. Philistia receives condemnation for their persistent hostility toward God's people, carried out with hearts full of ancient revenge. These coastal peoples have nursed their grievances across generations, passing down hatred like a family inheritance. Every conflict with Israel has been an opportunity to settle old scores rather than establish just relationships. The Philistine cities that have dominated the coastal plain for centuries will experience divine retribution that matches their own merciless treatment of others. The sea that brought them prosperity through trade will bring invaders to their shores. The fertile fields that supported their population will be trampled by foreign armies. The judgment against these nations serves multiple purposes in divine economy. It demonstrates that God's justice extends beyond the borders of Israel to encompass all peoples who abuse their power or oppress the vulnerable. The identical moral standards that apply to the covenant people also govern the actions of pagan nations. These prophecies also vindicate divine sovereignty over international affairs. The rise and fall of kingdoms does not depend solely on military might or economic resources, but on moral factors that most political analysts ignore. Nations that practice injustice will eventually face consequences regardless of their apparent strength or strategic advantages. The timing of judgment against surrounding nations coordinates with the destruction of Jerusalem to create a regional transformation that reshapes the entire political landscape. As Israel falls to Babylonian forces, Their neighbors will also face conquest by the identical imperial power. The judgment that seems to target God's people specifically will actually sweep across the entire region. This comprehensive judgment serves to isolate the remnant of Israel from the corrupting influences that have contributed to their spiritual downfall. The nations that have led God's people into idolatry and compromise will themselves be removed from positions where they can exercise such negative influence. The prophecies against the nations also prepare for future restoration by clearing away obstacles to renewed covenant faithfulness. When Israel eventually returns from exile, they will find a transformed regional environment where the sources of past temptation have been eliminated or significantly weakened. Divine justice reveals its impartial character through these international prophecies. The God of Israel does not show favoritism based on ethnic identity or religious affiliation. Moral behavior determines divine response, whether the actors are covenant people or pagan nations. This principle will later become central to prophetic understanding of universal divine kingdom. The catalogue of condemned nations demonstrates the comprehensive scope of divine knowledge and concern. God sees and judges the actions of every people group, every political entity, every cultural community. No nation exists beyond the reach of divine justice or outside the sphere of moral accountability. The specific accusations against each nation reveal different forms of moral failure that provoke divine wrath. Pride, cruelty, betrayal, oppression, exploitation. These sins appear in various combinations among the condemned nations, showing that moral corruption takes many forms, but always produces the identical, ultimate result. The prophecies also serve as warnings to other nations who might be tempted to follow similar paths. The principles of divine justice revealed through these judgments apply universally, offering guidance for how nations should conduct themselves if they wish to avoid similar fates. The destruction promised to surrounding nations will create power vacuums that Babylon will fill, accomplishing God's purposes through Nebuchadnezzar's imperial ambitions. The human agents of divine judgment rarely understand that they serve higher purposes, but their actions fulfill prophetic pronouncements with precision that validates divine sovereignty over historical processes. Yet, even in these harsh judgments against foreign nations, notes of eventual mercy emerge for those who survive the initial devastation. The door remains open for future inclusion in divine purposes, suggesting that judgment serves redemptive as well as punitive functions, even for pagan peoples. The prophecies against the nations establish a pattern that will recur throughout biblical prophecy. The conviction that all peoples stand under divine moral law and will be held accountable for their actions. This universal accountability provides the foundation for later prophetic visions of international divine kingdom, where all nations serve the one true God. The regional scope of judgment also demonstrates that Israel's covenant relationship with God has implications for surrounding peoples. The moral influence of God's people, whether positive or negative, affects their neighbors in ways that carry consequences for everyone involved. Covenant blessing or curse radiates outward to impact entire geographic regions. The fall of these nations will serve as object lessons for future generations about the certainty of divine justice and the futility of opposing divine purposes. Their ruins will testify to the reality of moral law that governs all human societies, regardless of their religious beliefs or cultural practices. The fall of Tyre. A maritime empire collapses. Along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, where cedar-scented winds carry the dreams of merchants across blue waters, stood the ancient city of Tyre. Her ships sailed to distant shores, bringing back ivory from Africa, silver from Spain, and precious stones from lands beyond the horizon. The purple dye that colored royal robes flowed from her workshops. Gold accumulated in her treasuries like autumn leaves gathering in temple courtyards. Ezekiel's vision turned toward this maritime power with the burden of divine judgment. The prophet's words painted pictures of a city that believed herself eternal, yet would learn the fragility of earthly glory. Tyre's merchant princes walked in silk and fine linen, their warehouses overflowing with goods from every corner of the known world. They had forgotten that all prosperity flows from sources beyond human control. The oracle began with lamentation, as though mourning a death that had not yet occurred. Ezekiel spoke of Tyre as a beautiful ship, perfectly crafted with planks of cypress and cedar, her masts reaching toward heaven like towers of ambition. Her oars were carved from oak, her deck inlaid with ivory. Every nation contributed to her magnificence. Yet this very beauty would become her downfall. Babylon's armies would arrive like a storm from the desert, their bronze weapons gleaming in the coastal sun. The siege would stretch across months, then years. The sounds of commerce would fade, replaced by the grinding of siege engines against stone walls. Harbor waters that once reflected the colorful sails of trading vessels would grow still and dark. Ezekiel's poetry captured the moment when maritime power meets terrestrial force. Ship captains would abandon their vessels, leaving them to drift empty on the waves. The princes of the sea would remove their embroidered robes, clothing themselves instead in trembling and fear. They would sit upon the ground, their former glory scattered like dust before the wind. The prophet described how other nations would react to Tyre's fall. Coastal cities would shake at the sound of her collapse, their own sense of security crumbling like walls built on sand. The islands would tremble, for if mighty Tyre could fall, what city could claim permanence? The lament would spread across the Mediterranean, carried by the identical winds that once brought news of profitable ventures. In Ezekiel's vision, the sea itself would swallow Tyre's remains. The great city would sink beneath the waves, becoming a place for fishermen to spread their nets. Where once stood towering walls and busy marketplaces, only the rhythm of tides would remain. The voices of merchants, the creaking of ships, the calls of sailors, all would be silenced by the eternal whisper of water against stone. The economic devastation would ripple outward like waves from a dropped stone. Cities that depended on Tyre's trade would find their own harbors empty, their treasuries depleted. The complex web of commerce that connected distant lands would unravel, leaving communities isolated and struggling. What had seemed like unshakable prosperity would prove as temporary as morning mist. Yet, beneath the judgment lay deeper truths about the nature of pride and power. Tyre had come to believe in her own invincibility, trusting in walls and weapons rather than acknowledging the source of all blessing. Her merchants had grown rich but forgotten wisdom. Her princes had accumulated power but lost sight of justice. The very success that made her great had planted seeds of her own destruction. The vision showed how earthly kingdoms rise and fall like tides, each believing itself eternal, while time reveals the temporary nature of all human achievement. Tyre's fall would echo through history, a reminder that even the mightiest empires are subject to forces beyond their control. The purple dye that once symbolized royalty would fade, the gold would tarnish, and the cedar ships would rot in harbors far from home. Through Ezekiel's prophecy, we see how divine justice operates, not through sudden lightning strikes, but through the gradual working of consequence and cause. Tyre's pride bred arrogance. Arrogance bred injustice, and injustice bred its own destruction. The prophet's words revealed patterns that would repeat throughout history as one empire after another would learn the identical hard lessons about the limits of human power. The lament for Tyre became a meditation on the fragility of civilization itself. All the beauty, all the wealth, all the careful planning that goes into building a great city can vanish like smoke in the wind. Yet in recognizing this fragility, we also discover something precious: the need for humility, for justice, for acknowledging that our achievements rest on foundations we did not lay. The king of Tyre, the fallen cherub. In the depths of Ezekiel's oracle against Tyre, a figure emerges who transcends the merely human. The prophet's vision shifts from the earthly king to a being of cosmic significance, a character whose story reaches back to the very dawn of creation. This is no ordinary ruler clothed in purple and gold, but a creature who once walked in the garden of God, perfect in beauty and wisdom until the day iniquity was found in him. The description unfolds like a dream half remembered, filled with images that stretch the boundaries of ordinary language. This figure had been the seal of perfection, the model by which all beauty was measured. Every precious stone adorned him. Ruby and topaz, emerald and beryl, sapphire and diamond, each one catching and reflecting the light of heaven. His very being was a symphony of color and radiance, a living jewel in the crown of creation. He had walked on the holy mountain of God, among stones of fire that sparkled like stars fallen to earth. His position was that of a guardian, a protector of sacred spaces, a being entrusted with responsibilities that reached to the very throne of the Almighty. The workmanship of his tambourines and pipes was prepared within him on the day of his creation, suggesting a being made for worship, for the creation of celestial music that would rise like incense before the divine presence. This was a creature who knew the inner chambers of heaven, who had access to mysteries hidden from ordinary minds. He possessed wisdom that surpassed human understanding, beauty that exceeded earthly comparison, and power that could reshape the very foundations of reality. Yet with all these gifts came a terrible vulnerability, the capacity for pride, for self-deception, for the gradual corruption of perfection. The transformation began subtly, like a single drop of poison in a clear stream. Pride crept into his heart, fed by the constant admiration of his own beauty. He began to believe that his splendor was self-generated, that his wisdom flowed from his own mind rather than from the source of all knowledge. The line between receiving glory and claiming it began to blur in his consciousness. Trade and commerce became his obsession, not the honest exchange of goods, but the accumulation of power through manipulation and deceit. Violence filled his inner being, though it was a violence of the spirit rather than of the sword. He corrupted his wisdom by his splendor, allowing the very gifts that made him great to become the instruments of his downfall. The fall itself was swift and terrible. He was cast out from the mountain of God, expelled from the sacred spaces he had once protected. The guardian became the exile, the protector became the destroyer. His beauty, which had once reflected divine glory, now served only to mask the corruption within. The stones of fire that had once warmed him with their light now burned him with their judgment. Yet this figure's story did not end with his expulsion. Cast down to earth, he brought with him the poison of rebellion, the seeds of corruption that would spread through human history like a disease. His influence would be felt in every act of pride, every moment of self-deception, every choice to trust in one's own power rather than acknowledge higher authority. The connection to the earthly king of Tyre becomes clear through this cosmic lens. The human ruler in his pride and self-deception was following a pattern set before the foundation of the world. He was walking in the footsteps of the fallen cherub, repeating the identical mistakes that had led to the first great rebellion. His fate would echo that ancient fall, as pride led to destruction and beauty gave way to ashes. This passage has echoed through centuries of theological reflection, offering a glimpse into the cosmic drama that plays out behind the scenes of human history. The fallen cherub represents the tragic possibility that even the most gifted, the most beautiful, the most privileged can choose the path of destruction. No amount of initial blessing can guarantee continued faithfulness. The story speaks to something deep in the human condition, the tendency to take credit for gifts we have received, to believe that our achievements are purely our own work. The king of Tyre, like the fallen cherub before him, forgot that all beauty, all wisdom, all power ultimately flows from a source beyond ourselves. When we cut ourselves off from that source, we begin the long slide toward corruption and ultimate defeat. Through this prophetic vision, Ezekiel revealed that the struggles of earthly kingdoms are part of a larger cosmic conflict. The rise and fall of nations, the pride and punishment of rulers, the patterns of judgment and restoration, all these reflect deeper spiritual realities that began before human history and will continue beyond it. The king of Tyre was not just a political figure, but a player in a drama that reaches from the Garden of Eden to the final judgment. Egypt humbled, the fall of the Nile Empire. The Nile flows northward through Egypt like a green ribbon laid across golden sand, bringing life to a land that would otherwise be desert. For thousands of years, this river had been the heartbeat of a civilization that built pyramids, reaching toward the stars, and temples that echoed with the prayers of countless generations. Pharaoh sat upon his throne, believing himself to be divine, a living god whose power stretched from the cataracts of the south to the delta marshes of the north. Ezekiel's prophetic vision turned toward this ancient kingdom with the burden of divine judgment. The prophet's words painted pictures of a power that had forgotten its own mortality, a ruler who claimed to have created the very river that gave him life. Egypt's pride had grown like the Nile during flood season, overflowing its banks and drowning the surrounding landscape in arrogance and self-deception. The oracle began with Pharaoh's own boast, echoing across the waters. He claimed ownership of the Nile, declaring that he had made it for himself. This was more than political rhetoric. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between ruler and creation. The river that brought fertility to his land, the sun that warmed his people, the very breath in his lungs. All these he attributed to his own power rather than acknowledging their true source. Ezekiel's vision revealed how this pride would be answered. The great dragon that was Egypt would be pulled from his river with hooks, his scales torn, and his body left to die in the wilderness. The imagery was both political and cosmic, describing not just the fall of a nation, but the humbling of a worldview that placed human power at the center of existence. The prophet spoke of sword and famine coming to Egypt, of her people scattered among the nations like seeds blown by a harsh wind. The land that had been a place of refuge for others would itself need refuge. The nation that had enslaved Israel centuries before would learn what it meant to be powerless, to depend on the mercy of others for survival. Yet the judgment was not merely punitive, but educational. Egypt would be made desolate for 40 years, a symbolic period of testing and purification. During this time, the scattered Egyptians would learn lessons that prosperity had never taught them. They would discover that strength comes not from controlling rivers and ruling peoples, but from understanding one's place in the larger order of creation. The vision showed how Egypt's influence had spread beyond her borders, how other nations had come to depend on her power and protection. When the great cedar fell, the smaller trees around it would be crushed by its weight. Nations that had allied themselves with Egypt would find themselves exposed and vulnerable, their trust in human power revealed as misplaced confidence. Ezekiel described the effect on surrounding peoples when news of Egypt's fall reached them. Kings would tremble on their thrones, realizing that if mighty Egypt could be brought low, no earthly power could claim permanence. The very foundations of international relations would shift as nations learned to look beyond military might and economic prosperity for lasting security. The prophet's words revealed deeper truths about the nature of civilizations and their relationship to the divine. Egypt had become a broken reed, appearing strong but unable to support those who leaned upon it. Her promises of protection had proven hollow. Her offers of alliance had led to disappointment and disaster. What had seemed like strength was revealed as weakness. What had appeared as wisdom was shown to be folly. Through 40 years of exile and humiliation, Egypt would learn what Israel had learned during her own wilderness wanderings. The desert has a way of teaching lessons that palaces cannot provide. When the familiar sources of security are removed, when the comfortable illusions of power are stripped away, then deeper truths can finally be heard and understood. The restoration that would follow this judgment would be different from Egypt's former glory. She would return to her land, but as a lowly kingdom, no longer proud and self-sufficient. This humbling was not meant to destroy, but to heal, not to punish, but to educate. Egypt would find her proper place in the family of nations, neither dominating others nor being dominated by them. The vision extended beyond Egypt to reveal a pattern that would repeat throughout history. Nations rise and fall. Empires expand and contract, but the underlying spiritual laws remain constant. Pride leads to fall. Humility leads to restoration. Those who acknowledge their dependence on higher powers find stability, while those who trust only in their own strength discover the fragility of all human achievement. Egypt's judgment served as a mirror for all nations, reflecting the dangers of believing in one's own invincibility. The Nile would continue to flow. The sun would continue to rise, but the human systems built around these natural gifts would prove as temporary as morning mist. Only those who understood their place in the larger order would find lasting peace and prosperity. The watchman on the wall. Ezekiel's new role. In the aftermath of Jerusalem's fall, as the dust of prophecy settled and the burden of fulfilled judgment pressed upon the hearts of the exiled, Ezekiel found himself called to a new kind of service. The role of the watchman emerged from the ancient practice of posting guards upon city walls, men whose eyes scanned the horizon for approaching danger, whose voices would cry out warnings to sleeping inhabitants. Now the prophet would become such a figure, but for spiritual rather than physical threats. The metaphor carried deep significance in the ancient world. A watchman's duty was sacred. Lives depended upon his vigilance, his courage, his willingness to sound the alarm, even when others might prefer comfortable silence. He stood alone in the darkness, separated from the warm companionship of those he protected, his attention fixed upon distant movements that might signal approaching doom. God's words to Ezekiel carried both honor and burden. The prophet was no longer merely a vessel for divine pronouncements, but a guardian of human souls. His responsibility extended beyond delivering messages to ensuring they were received and understood. The watchman must not only see the danger, but communicate it in ways that would stir sleepers from their dreams of safety. The burden of this calling was immense. If the watchman saw the sword coming and failed to warn the people, their blood would be required at his hand. However, if he faithfully sounded the trumpet and the people chose not to listen, their destruction would be upon their own heads. This distinction created a delicate balance between divine sovereignty and human responsibility that would echo through centuries of religious thought. Ezekiel's earlier years of enforced silence had prepared him for this moment. The long months of muteness had taught him the value of words, the power of speech, the responsibility that comes with the ability to communicate divine truth. Now, as his tongue was loosened, each word would carry the burden of eternal consequence. The prophet's message to his people took on new urgency and personal application. He was no longer speaking primarily about distant Jerusalem or foreign nations, but about the immediate spiritual condition of those around him. The sword he watched for was not made of bronze or iron, but of spiritual consequence, cutting through the illusions that kept people trapped in destructive patterns. The watchman's call extended beyond mere warning to include encouragement and hope. Just as a guard on the wall might signal the approach of friendly forces or the dawn of a new day, Ezekiel would also announce opportunities for repentance and renewal. The identical voice that cried danger would also proclaim the possibility of life and restoration. This role required a particular kind of courage, the willingness to speak uncomfortable truths to people who might prefer pleasant lies. The watchman could not modify his message to make it more palatable, could not soften warnings to avoid giving offense. His duty was to accuracy and clarity, regardless of how his words might be received. The watchman's image also brought with it a feeling of hope and safety. Although his presence meant warnings of potential danger, the fact that he stood guard on the wall indicated that protection was achievable, that staying alert could ward off catastrophe. The people had not been left to face their destiny alone, but were being tenderly protected by someone who cared deeply enough to remain vigilant throughout the dark hours of night. This new role for Ezekiel marked a wider transformation in how he carried out his prophetic work. In earlier times, his primary focus had been declaring judgment upon a nation that had turned away from God, but now his attention shifted toward nurturing and leading a surviving remnant through the challenging journey of spiritual healing. The one who had destroyed was now becoming one who healed. The accuser was now becoming an advisor. The image of the watchman also highlighted how personal spiritual accountability truly is. Every single person must make their own choice about how to react to the warnings they hear. The prophet had the ability to raise the alarm, yet he couldn't make people seek safety. He could identify the danger that was approaching, yet he couldn't force them to run away. Each individual who listened to his message had to make the final decision themselves. This teaching held deep significance for grasping the connection between God's grace and human choice. Divine warnings and chances for turning back are provided by God, but the answer must emerge from within the human heart. The watchman's warning created room for decision-making, for the exercise of free moral choice, for the real possibility of both rescue and ruin. Through taking on this new responsibility, Ezekiel came to understand that prophecy wasn't simply about predicting what would happen in the future, but about influencing it through faithful warnings and caring guidance. The voice of the watchman had the power to prevent the very catastrophes he announced, transforming prophecy into a tool of compassion rather than simply condemnation. The messenger shows up. Jerusalem has been destroyed. The runner's feet had transported him across hundreds of miles of barren desert, through valleys filled with the howling of jackals and across hills where nothing but thorns managed to grow. His news was straightforward, yet world-shattering. Jerusalem had been destroyed. The city that had existed for hundreds of years as the place where God's name dwelt, the temple that had served as the center of Jewish religious life, the protective walls that had sheltered David's throne, everything now lay in ruins. When the messenger arrived at the exiled community beside Babylon's rivers, his announcement landed like heavy stones dropping into calm water, sending waves of disbelief and sorrow spreading through every home. For many years, Ezekiel had been prophesying about this very moment, had dramatized it through street performances, had issued warnings and appeals, and proclaimed the approaching judgment. Now, his predictions had been confirmed in the most devastating way imaginable. The report came on the 10th day of the 10th month, during the 12th year of captivity. The precise recording of this date emphasized how important it was. This represented a moment that people would commemorate, note on their calendars, and hand down through future generations as a dividing point between the world that was and whatever would come next. The former world had come to an end, and something entirely new would need to take its place. For Ezekiel personally, the arrival of the messenger signaled a deep transformation. God's hand had rested upon him the previous evening, getting him ready for what lay ahead. His extended period of forced silence was finally coming to a close. The voice that had been locked inside would soon be released to speak fresh words for a fresh era. The prophet's inability to speak had persisted for years, only interrupted when divine communications required expression. Throughout this time, he had communicated mainly through symbolic actions, the unusual demonstrations that had made him an object of fascination and worry among the people around him. Now, as the reality of Jerusalem's destruction began to sink in, the necessity for spoken words would return with renewed importance. The emotional effect on the community living in exile was enormous. Many had held on to hope that Jerusalem might somehow survive, that the temple would remain standing, that God wouldn't permit his chosen city to fall. They had understood Ezekiel's prophecies as warnings that might be avoided, rather than predictions that were certain. Now they confronted the total collapse of everything they had believed about their special position and divine safety. Some people had criticized Ezekiel for being overly severe, overly negative, overly ready to pronounce doom on his own community. Others had written him off as someone mentally unstable whose dramatic displays had no real meaning. The messenger's account silenced every such criticism and proved the prophet's work had been legitimate. His statements had not been the confused ramblings of a troubled mind, but the accurate delivery of divine truth. This moment also represented a shift in what prophecy itself meant. Ezekiel's function was changing from accuser to counselor, from one who announces judgment to one who guides recovery. The people needed different kinds of messages at this point. Comforting words for those grieving, direction for those confused, encouragement for those losing hope. The prophet, who had focused on warnings, would now need to master the vocabulary of restoration. Jerusalem's fall created serious theological questions that would occupy Jewish thinking for many generations. How could God permit his own dwelling place to be demolished? What did it signify for the covenant people to be dispersed among foreign nations? Did this mark the conclusion of the unique bond between the divine and Israel? Or might this possibly be a fresh start disguised as an ending? These questions couldn't be resolved quickly or simply. They would demand years of contemplation, prayer, and attentive listening to comprehend how divine intentions were being fulfilled through what appeared to be disaster. The messenger's report wasn't merely information, but a challenge to everything the exiles thought they understood about their faith and their future. The opening of Ezekiel's mouth held symbolic importance beyond just the restoration of his ability to speak. It marked the start of a new phase of divine revelation. One centered not on judgment but on rebuilding. The voice that had been made silent would now declare words of hope, direction, and assurance. The prophet, who had witnessed destruction, would become a messenger of restoration. The moment when this change occurred was not random. God's people needed to experience judgment, both announced and completed, before they could be prepared to accept promises of restoration. The old ways of thinking, the false sources of security, the arrogant assumptions, all of these needed to be completely torn down before something new could be constructed in their place. As information circulated through the exiled community, people started viewing Ezekiel differently. The unusual prophet who had appeared so extreme in his warnings was now shown to be a faithful servant who had been speaking the truth the entire time. His credibility, established through this painful confirmation, would make his coming messages of hope and restoration even more compelling and trustworthy. The shepherds receive condemnation, Israel's failed leaders. In the rolling countryside where sheep had grazed since Abraham's time, the shepherd's image held profound meaning for Israel. A good shepherd recognized each animal individually, guided them to green pastures and fresh water, defended them from wolves and lions, looked for any that wandered off, and cared for the injured. This picture of devoted care had influenced how God's people understood both divine love and human authority. Ezekiel's prophecy transformed this well-known image into a cutting instrument of judgment directed at Israel's leaders. The shepherds who were supposed to have protected God's flock had exploited them instead. They had nourished themselves while the sheep remained hungry, dressed themselves in quality wool while the animals shivered from cold. When danger threatened the flock, these shepherds had escaped to safety, abandoning their charges to be scattered and attacked. The accusation was detailed and crushing. These leaders had governed through force and harshness, displaying no compassion for the vulnerable or care for those who strayed. They had not given strength to the diseased sheep or brought healing to the sick. The wounded had been abandoned to their pain. The lost had been left to whatever fate awaited them. Rather than gathering those who were scattered, they had pushed them even further away through their severity and lack of concern. The results of this leadership failure spread through the whole nation. Without adequate guidance, the people had become dispersed across the mountains, spread across the entire earth, with nobody to look for them or show concern for their situation. They had become prey for wild animals, vulnerable to every predator wandering the wilderness. The protective framework that should have ensured their safety had broken down, leaving them exposed and isolated. Ezekiel's vision reached beyond the immediate historical circumstances to expose deeper truths about the character of authority and accountability. Those granted leadership positions weren't meant to exploit them for selfish benefit, but for the welfare of those under their care. Power represented a tool for defense and provision, not for abuse and domination. The prophet's message depicted how these false shepherds had corrupted their calling. They had taken the strongest and healthiest sheep for their own use, leaving the weak and ill to manage on their own. They had constructed their own wealth on the suffering of those they were meant to protect. The very qualities that made them capable leaders had been twisted into tools of selfishness and cruelty. The religious leaders received special examination. They had been given the sacred duty of teaching God's ways and preserving the spiritual health of the nation. Instead, they had guided the people into idol worship and false religious practices. They had declared peace when peace didn't exist, had offered pleasant words when harsh correction was required. Their failure wasn't merely political but spiritual, affecting the very soul of the nation. The political rulers faced equally severe condemnation. They had been chosen to establish fairness and maintain social order, to defend the vulnerable and protect the innocent. Instead, they had twisted justice for their own advantage, had mistreated the poor and shown favoritism to the wealthy. Their legal systems had become centers of corruption instead of righteousness. Their policies had served themselves rather than the people entrusted to them. The economic leaders had similarly failed in their duties. They had been given chances to create wealth and allocate resources justly. Instead, they had accumulated wealth for themselves, had taken advantage of workers, and cheated consumers. The systems that should have met everyone's needs had been manipulated to satisfy the greed of a small group. The military leaders had shown equal faithlessness. They had been trusted with defending the nation, protecting the innocent, maintaining order. Instead, they had used their authority to threaten and dominate, had neglected to prepare for genuine dangers while provoking unnecessary conflicts. When real danger arrived, they had been incapable of providing adequate defense. The failure of these shepherds wasn't simply a matter of being incompetent, but represented a fundamental betrayal. They had received sacred responsibilities and had broken them. They had been shown the model of good leadership and had intentionally chosen the opposite direction. Their failure was deliberate and continuous, revealing a hardness of heart that made restoration impossible. The picture of scattered sheep communicated both the tragedy of the circumstances and the possibility for future restoration. Sheep that had been driven away could be brought back together, injuries could be healed, strength could be regained. However, this would require different shepherds, leaders who grasped that their role was service rather than control, protection rather than exploitation. The condemnation of the shepherds functioned as a warning to all who would hold authority in the future. Leadership wasn't a privilege to enjoy, but a responsibility to fulfill faithfully. Those who failed in this obligation would face divine judgment, while those who served well would receive divine favor. The expectation was clear. The welfare of the flock must always take priority over the comfort of the shepherd, the promise of a new shepherd, the coming messianic king. Following the judgment pronounced upon the failed shepherds, hope appeared like sunrise breaking across faraway mountains. The same voice that had declared condemnation now offered promises of renewal. God would not abandon his people to remain scattered and vulnerable forever. A new shepherd would arrive, one who would demonstrate all the characteristics that the previous leaders had been missing. This promised shepherd would be unlike those who came before. He wouldn't take advantage of the flock for his own gain, but would sacrifice his life for their benefit. He wouldn't push the sheep away through harshness, but would bring them together gently, carrying those who were weak and leading those who were strong. His leadership would be characterized by fairness and mercy, power and gentleness, understanding and humility. The prophecy looked back to Israel's greatest period, to the time when David had led with honesty and ability. This future shepherd would resemble David, yet exceed David. He would have the warrior king's bravery and the poet's sensitivity, the ruler's power and the musician's heart. Through him, the divided tribes would be brought back together. The violated covenant would be made new, and Israel's glory would be brought back. The image of David carried deep meaning for the people living in exile. He had been the model king, the measure against which all others were judged. His reign had been marked by military success, economic growth, and spiritual awakening. The temple had been conceived during his time. The Psalms had poured from his pen, and the kingdom had expanded to its widest boundaries under his rule. However, this new David would surpass even those accomplishments. He wouldn't merely bring Israel back to her previous glory, but would raise her to heights never previously conceived. His kingdom wouldn't be confined by geographic borders or endangered by hostile armies. His reign would last forever, his peace would never end, and his justice would reach all peoples. The promise described a fundamental change in the very nature of leadership. This shepherd wouldn't rule from afar, but would live among his people, experiencing their happiness and sadness, their dreams and anxieties. He would recognize each member of his flock personally, comprehending their requirements and addressing their situations with complete wisdom and boundless love. The prophecy also promised restoration for the serious wounds that had been caused by the false shepherds. The ill would be made healthy. The injured would be brought back to wellness. The lost would be located and brought home. The dispersed flock would be assembled from every part of the earth, and the unity that had been destroyed would be permanently re-established. This new shepherd would create a covenant of peace that would change not only human connections, but the fundamental character of existence itself. Dangerous animals would no longer endanger the flock. Destructive forces would be eliminated from the land, and plenty would take the place of shortage. The earth itself would produce its harvest, and the people would live in safety and confidence. The promise reached beyond simple political restoration to include spiritual rebirth. This shepherd wouldn't only meet physical requirements but would feed souls, wouldn't only defend from outside dangers but would mend internal injuries. His presence would bring the separated people into a fresh relationship with their God, defined by closeness and comprehension rather than separation and fear. The description of this future leader contained messianic qualities that would echo through centuries of Jewish and Christian reflection. Here was a figure who would unite the functions of king, priest, and prophet, who would be both human and divine, who would connect heaven and earth in a manner that had never been witnessed before. The moment when this promise was given was meaningful. It arrived after the judgment had been announced and the results had been experienced. The people had discovered through painful experience the price of following false shepherds. They were prepared to value true leadership, prepared to dedicate themselves to following one who would guide them in righteousness rather than exploitation. The promise also represented a call to faithfulness in the present moment. While they waited for the coming shepherd, the people were called to get themselves ready for his arrival. They were to absorb the lessons that their suffering had taught them, to move away from the behaviors that had resulted in destruction, and to develop the qualities that would make them deserving of the restoration that was promised. The new shepherd wouldn't arrive as a conqueror, forcing his authority upon resistant subjects, but as a caring leader gathering those who desired his guidance. His authority would be founded not on force, but on love, not on fear, but on confidence. Those who followed him would do so willingly, discovering in his leadership the satisfaction of their deepest desires and the solution to their greatest requirements. A new heart, the promise of spiritual transformation. Deep inside the human chest, protected by the ribs and powered by muscles, beats the heart that keeps life going. In ancient thinking, this organ was more than simply a blood pump. It was the center of thinking and emotion, the origin of choice and longing, the essence of what made each individual unique. When Ezekiel described a new heart, he was promising change at the most fundamental level of human being. The prophet's message depicted a picture of dramatic internal transformation. The heart of stone that had become hardened through years of defiance and resistance would be exchanged for a heart of flesh that could sense and react. The mind that had been shut to divine truth would be opened to accept wisdom. The spirit that had been unresponsive to spiritual truth would be awakened to new life and awareness. This transformation wouldn't be achieved through human striving or determination. The change would result from divine action, a supernatural work that would penetrate into the core of human personality and reconstruct it according to heaven's blueprint. The same force that had brought the universe into being would recreate the human heart, shaping it into something capable of love, obedience, and relationship with the divine. The promise confronted the core problem that had troubled humanity from the very beginning. The difficulty was not simply external, wrong behaviors, damaged relationships, unjust structures, but internal. The heart itself was flawed, the source from which all other difficulties emerged. Until this underlying cause was dealt with, no permanent change would be achievable. The comparison of stone and flesh conveyed the distinction between death and life. A heart of stone couldn't develop, couldn't transform, couldn't respond to love or direction. It was locked in its rigidity, resistant to influence, unable to form genuine relationship. However, a heart of flesh was living, responsive, capable of development and transformation, and deep connection. The new spirit that would come with this heart replacement would make obedience possible that had previously been unattainable. The law that had been inscribed on stone tablets would now be written on tablets of flesh. What had been external commands would become internal drives. The tension between desire and obligation would be settled through the alignment of human will with divine intention. This spiritual rebirth would impact every dimension of human experience. Relationships would be changed as hearts discovered how to love authentically rather than selfishly. Work would gain significance as people found their genuine purpose and calling. Worship would become spontaneous and delightful rather than burdensome and mechanical. The artificial division between sacred and everyday would disappear as all of life became an expression of commitment. The promise also described a new closeness between God and humanity. The gap that had defined the old relationship would be replaced by nearness and understanding. People would experience their Creator personally, rather than just hearing about him from others. The voice that had seemed far away and unclear would become familiar and clear. This transformation would be complete, impacting not just individuals but whole communities. Families would experience healing, neighbors would be brought back together, and nations would discover how to coexist in peace. The social frameworks that had been damaged by human selfishness would be renewed according to divine principles of fairness and compassion. The prophet's vision extended beyond Israel's immediate restoration to embrace all of humanity. The new heart wouldn't be restricted to one nation or one group, but would be accessible to all who were ready to accept it. The divisions that had separated humanity would be torn down, and a new unity would develop based on shared spiritual life rather than ethnic or cultural likeness. The moment when this promise was given was important. It came after the people had lived through the results of their hardened hearts. They had learned through difficult experience that their own attempts at reform were not enough. They were ready to recognize their need for divine action and to welcome the radical change that was being presented. The promise also held implications for how the renewed people would connect with their surroundings. The new heart would bring a new awareness of responsibility and care. The earth would no longer be viewed as something to exploit, but as a gift to tend. The creatures sharing the planet would be treated with respect and kindness. This spiritual renewal would also change the understanding of time and forever. the new heart would have vision beyond the immediate, would make choices based on enduring values rather than temporary wants. The fear of death would be replaced by assurance in eternal life, and the worry about the future would surrender to trust in divine care. The promise of a new heart offered hope for those who had lost faith in themselves. People who had attempted repeatedly to change and had failed repeatedly would learn that transformation was achievable when it came from the correct source. The same divine force that had created the world would be available to recreate human nature itself. The valley of dry bones, life emerging from death. In the depths of a vision more clear than any dream, Ezekiel discovered himself standing in a valley where sunlight threw long shadows across a scene of hopelessness. Spread across the ground, extending as far as vision could reach, lay bones, not the aftermath of a single battle, but the collected evidence of innumerable defeats. These weren't recent casualties, but ancient remains, whitened by years of exposure, dried by wind and weather, until they appeared more like rocks than remnants of living creatures. The Spirit of the Lord placed the prophet down in the center of this desolation and led him to walk among the bones. Each step uncovered new evidence of how massive the disaster that had taken place here was. Ribs lay disconnected from backbones. Skulls sat far from the limbs that had once supported them. The bones weren't just plentiful, but extremely dry, indicating death that had happened long ago, and hope that had been given up for generations. The question arrived with divine power. Son of man, are these bones able to live? The impossibility of the circumstances was clear to anyone observing. Death had completed its work entirely here. No breath was left. No spark of life remained. No chance of revival existed within the natural order. Yet the question itself indicated that natural limits might not be the final answer on this subject. Ezekiel's answer showed both wisdom and modesty. "O Lord God, you are the one who knows." He didn't claim to grasp the mysteries of life and death, didn't pretend to see past the evidence before his eyes. However, he also didn't restrict divine power by his own comprehension. He placed the question back into the hands of the one who had posed it, recognizing that some answers belong to domains beyond human understanding. The command that came next was both straightforward and impossible. Prophesy to these bones. The prophet was instructed to speak words of life to remains of death, to address an audience that possessed no ears to hear. This was prophecy in its most basic form, speaking divine truth into circumstances where human wisdom perceived no possibility for transformation. As Ezekiel started to speak, the impossible started to happen. The Word of God possessed power that went beyond the apparent hopelessness of the circumstances. The bones started to shift, not chaotically, but with intention and direction. Each piece looked for its correct place, ribs linking to backbones, joints discovering their partners, the scattered remains arranging themselves into complete skeletons. The sound that came with this reassembly was both amazing and frightening. It was the sound of resurrection, of life coming back to places where death had appeared permanent. The rattling and clicking of bones finding their positions created a symphony of restoration that resonated across the valley like thunder, signaling the approach of a storm. However, the reconstruction wasn't finished with the joining of bones. Tendons emerged to connect the structures together. Muscles developed to supply strength and motion. Skin wrapped the bodies to give them shape and defense. What had been dispersed, fragments became complete forms, prepared for life, but not yet alive. The second command disclosed the origin of true life. Prophesy to the breath. The Hebrew term for breath was identical to the term for spirit, indicating that what was required was not merely biological function, but spiritual energy. The prophet was to summon the four winds to bring breath into these bodies, to change form into life. The response was quick and striking. Breath filled the reconstructed bodies, and they became alive. Not just a handful, but all of them. An incredibly large army rising from what had been a graveyard of hopelessness. The transformation was finished. The restoration was absolute. and the impossibility had become truth through divine action. The vision's significance was disclosed through direct interpretation. These bones stood for the entire house of Israel, dispersed and apparently beyond hope. The people had been declaring that their bones were dry, their hope was gone, and they were totally separated from any chance of restoration. They had accepted death as their permanent state and despair as their fitting reaction. However, the vision announced a different truth. The God who could restore life to dry bones could also bring life back to a dead nation. The same force that had formed humanity from dust could reform them from the scattered pieces of their previous existence. Death was not the conclusion of the story, but simply a chapter in a bigger narrative of divine intentions. The promise went beyond simple restoration to transformation. The people who would be raised from their graves wouldn't simply go back to their previous state, but would be given new life, new power, new purpose. They would become an army, organized and capable, prepared to fulfill divine objectives in the world. The vision also disclosed the process of restoration. It wouldn't occur instantly, but in phases. First, the collecting of scattered elements, then the connecting together of what belonged together, then the protecting of what had been vulnerable, and finally the breathing of life into what had been prepared. Each phase was required. Each had its own function, and none could be omitted or hurried. The function of prophetic declaration in this process was essential. The word of God spoken through human voices became the tool of divine force. The prophet's voice possessed authority that exceeded human comprehension, bringing into being realities that surpassed natural possibilities. This was the power of faithful declaration, not merely describing what existed, but calling into being what could exist through divine action. The two sticks, north and south, brought back together. In Ezekiel's hands, two common pieces of wood became symbols of remarkable hope. The prophet took these simple objects and changed them into a prophetic sign that would communicate across centuries of separation and struggle. One stick carried the name of Judah, standing for the southern kingdom that had preserved the Davidic line and the temple worship. The other bore the name of Joseph, standing for the northern kingdom that had been carried into exile by Assyria more than 100 years earlier. The act of inscribing these names was itself meaningful. Each stick became a scroll, a record of identity and legacy. The name of Judah recalled the tribe that had produced kings and had been promised that the scepter would not leave it. The name of Joseph remembered the favored son who had received a double portion, whose descendants had become the principal tribes of the northern kingdom. These sticks stood for more than political separations. They represented the deep injuries in Israel's heart. The kingdom that had been unified under David and Solomon had been ripped apart by pride, jealousy, and competing ambitions. Brother had battled against brother. Temple worship had been substituted with golden calves, and the people who shared a common legacy had become hostile enemies. The northern kingdom had vanished into history's mists, its people dispersed among the nations and seemingly lost permanently. The southern kingdom had kept its identity longer, but had eventually experienced the same destiny. The unity that had once made Israel powerful had been destroyed, and the pieces lay dispersed across the ancient world like fragments of a shattered vessel. However, in Ezekiel's vision, these fragments would be collected and connected together again. The prophet received instructions to take the two sticks and hold them in his hand as one. The symbolism was obvious. What had been separated would be unified, what had been divided would be connected, what had been shattered would be mended. The miraculous joining of the sticks would be apparent to all who observed. They would see the prophet holding two distinct pieces of wood, each carrying its own name and representing its own history. However then, in a moment that would reveal divine force, the sticks would become one in his hand. The separation would vanish, the division would conclude, and unity would take the place of fragmentation. The people's response was foreseeable. They would inquire what this sign signified, what message was being transmitted through this simple yet powerful demonstration. The question would provide the prophet an opportunity to clarify the deeper meaning of what they had observed. Not simply the joining of two pieces of wood, but the reuniting of two peoples. The explanation would disclose the extent of divine intention. The God who had permitted division would also bring about unity. The dispersed tribes would be assembled from among the nations where they had been spread. The northern kingdom that had been lost would be discovered. The southern kingdom that had been broken would be restored, and together they would become one nation once more. This unity wouldn't be simply political but spiritual. The people would be purified from their idol worship, liberated from their rebellions, and brought back to right relationship with their God. The divisions that had pushed them apart would be healed. The conflicts that had drained their energies would be settled, and the harmony that had been lost would be recovered. The reunited nation would have one king, one shepherd, to guide them. The promise looked back to the golden age of David, when the kingdom had been unified and powerful. However, this future king would exceed David, possessing not just political power, but spiritual authority. Under his guidance, the people would follow divine statutes and keep divine judgments. The vision reached beyond reunion to rebirth. The land that had been separated would be brought back to its previous fertility. The people who had been dispersed would return to their inheritance. The covenant that had been violated would be renewed on a stronger foundation. The relationship between God and his people would be established permanently, never again to be interrupted by unfaithfulness or rebellion. The promise also described a new sanctuary that would be built among the people. This wouldn't be simply a building, but a symbol of divine presence, a guarantee that God would live with his people permanently. The glory that had left the temple would come back, and the divine presence would never again be removed. The effect of this vision on the exiled people was significant. They had grown up listening to stories of the great kingdom that had once existed, of the unity and strength that had made their ancestors powerful. However, that appeared like distant history, a golden age that could never be regained. The prophecy of the two sticks declared that what appeared impossible was actually inevitable. The sign also held implications for comprehending divine purposes in history. The divisions that had appeared so lasting, the conflicts that had seemed so impossible to resolve, the injuries that had looked so deep, all these were temporary problems that would be settled through divine action. What human wisdom couldn't accomplish, what political skill couldn't achieve, what military strength couldn't impose, would be accomplished through the mysterious working of divine will. The two sticks became a symbol of hope for all who had known division and conflict. They communicated to families separated by disagreement, to communities divided by prejudice, to nations separated by ancient resentments. The message was obvious. What had been shattered could be mended. What had been separated could be unified. What had been lost could be discovered again. The invasion of Gog and Magog, the final conflict, from the distant reaches of the north, past the edges of the known world, would arrive a force unlike any that had been witnessed before. Ezekiel's vision penetrated through the curtain of time to disclose a final confrontation between the forces of darkness and the restored people of God. This was not merely another political conflict or territorial disagreement, but a cosmic struggle that would determine the world's fate. The enemy was commanded by a figure named Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal from the land of Magog. These names held threatening significance, standing for powers that existed beyond the civilized world, forces that embodied chaos and devastation. Gog was not simply a human leader, but a symbol of everything that opposed divine order and purpose. The description of this invading force was both detailed and enigmatic. It would be a massive company, a powerful army pulled from many nations. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya would march beneath Gog's banner along with Gomer and Togarmah from the distant north. This was not a regional struggle, but a worldwide coalition unified in opposition to God's people. The imagery suggested crushing power and apparently unstoppable momentum. The army would be like a cloud blanketing the land, like a storm descending from the mountains. Their weapons would shine in the sunlight. Their horses would pound across the earth, and their battle cries would resound from horizon to horizon. The very earth would shake under their feet as they moved forward. The moment when this invasion would occur was significant. It would arrive when Israel was living peacefully in their land. When the walls had been reconstructed and the cities had been renewed, the people would be existing in peace, their swords transformed to plowshares, their spears changed into pruning hooks. The attack would arrive when they were least ready for war, most exposed to assault. The reason for this invasion was both material and spiritual. Gog would come to seize, spoil, and to take plunder, drawn by the wealth of the restored nation. However, beneath this surface, reason lay deeper forces. The ancient hatred of darkness for light, the eternal struggle between good and evil, the final effort to stop divine purposes from being accomplished. The prophet's vision disclosed the divine perspective on these events. What would seem to human observers as a military campaign was actually part of a bigger plan. God would put hooks in Gog's jaws and turn him around, leading him against the mountains of Israel. The invasion would fulfill divine purposes, even as it endangered divine people. The description of the army's advance was filled with powerful imagery. They would arrive like a whirlwind. Their approach would be like the rushing of mighty waters, and their presence would be like a plague of locusts, blanketing the land. The very elements would seem to be working against the defenders as this enormous force swept southward. The geography of the struggle was carefully described. The battle would occur on the mountains of Israel, in the land that had been given back to its people. The valleys that had once resonated with the songs of harvest would ring with the clash of weapons. The hills that had been filled with vineyards would be trampled beneath the feet of armies. The world's reaction to this invasion would be mixed. Some nations would object, asking whether Gog had come to take plunder and carry away spoil. However, their objections would be weak and useless, more worried about their own interests than with justice. The restored Israel would face this danger essentially alone, deserted by those who might have provided assistance. The magnitude of the invasion would be unprecedented. Never before had such a force been assembled. Never had such a danger been mounted against God's people. The armies of Babylon and Assyria would appear small by comparison. Even the powerful hosts of Egypt would pale beside this coalition of nations, unified in their opposition to divine purposes. The emotional effect of this invasion would be tremendous. The people who had just started to feel secure in their restored land would suddenly face the chance of total destruction. The promises of lasting peace and safety would appear to be mocked by this overwhelming danger. Faith would be tested to its breaking point as human resources proved totally insufficient. The vision also disclosed the spiritual dimensions of this struggle. This was not merely a battle between human armies, but a confrontation between spiritual forces. The powers of darkness would make their final effort to overthrow divine authority, to stop the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, to prove that evil was stronger than good. The description of Gog's army included supernatural elements that indicated forces beyond the merely human. The weapons would be of types never before witnessed. The tactics would be of unprecedented sophistication, and the coordination would be of impossible complexity. This was an enemy that combined all the worst aspects of human warfare with powers that went beyond natural limits. The danger was not just to Israel, but to all of God's purposes in the world. If this invasion succeeded, it would not just mean the destruction of one nation, but the defeat of divine plans for human redemption. The stakes could not be higher. The results could not be more significant, and the outcome could not be more crucial for the world's future. God's crushing victory. Gog annihilated. In the moment when human hope appeared most fragile, when the forces of darkness seemed unstoppable, when the very foundations of divine promise appeared about to collapse, the true power behind all history would finally be unveiled. The invasion of Gog would become the platform for the most dramatic demonstration of divine authority ever witnessed, a display of power that would resolve forever the question of who truly governs the world. The divine response would start with phenomena that went beyond natural explanation. The earth itself would tremble with a great shaking, as if the very foundations of creation were reacting to the presence of ultimate evil. Mountains would be cast down, cliffs would crumble, and walls would collapse to the ground. The stable landmarks that had provided security for generations would prove as fragile as sandcastles before the tide. However, this was only the start. The God who had created the elements would transform them into weapons of unprecedented power. Torrential rain would pour from skies that had been clear moments earlier, flooding valleys and transforming roads into rivers. Hailstones of tremendous size would crash down upon the invading army, each one carrying the force of divine judgment. Fire and brimstone would rain from heaven, reminiscent of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but on a magnitude that would dwarf that ancient judgment. The very air would become a weapon, carrying death to those who had come to bring death. What had appeared like an unstoppable force would be shown as utterly powerless before the Creator of all things. The confusion among Gog's forces would be total and catastrophic. The army that had marched in perfect coordination would turn upon itself in panic and terror. Brother would battle against brother. Ally would become foe. And the coalition that had appeared so formidable would destroy itself through internal conflict. The very unity that had made them strong would become the source of their weakness. The divine promise was clear and thorough. I will summon a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains. Every height in the land would become a place of judgment. Every valley would witness divine victory. The mountains that had been endangered would become the platforms from which divine power would be displayed. The scale of this victory would be beyond human comprehension. The army that had appeared like a cloud covering the land would be reduced to scattered remnants. The weapons that had gleamed so threateningly in the sunlight would be broken and burned. The horses that had thundered across the earth would lie motionless, their riders thrown down in defeat. The aftermath would provide lasting testimony to what had taken place. The bodies of the fallen would blanket the mountains and fill the valleys, creating a scene of such total devastation that it would be remembered for generations. The birds of the air and the beasts of the field would feast upon the remains, completing the cycle of judgment that had started with divine wrath. The weapons of war that had been brought for destruction would be changed into fuel for peace. The people of Israel would burn them for 7 years, using the instruments of war to warm their homes and cook their food. The irony would be complete. What had been intended to destroy would instead serve to nurture and sustain. The burial of the dead would require 7 months, demanding the efforts of the whole nation. Even then, the task would not be finished, and professional searchers would continue to locate and bury remains for years afterward. The land would be purified slowly and thoroughly, every trace of the invasion eliminated until no evidence remained of the great danger that had once appeared so overwhelming. The burial place would be given a special name, the Valley of Hamon Gog, meaning the multitude of Gog. This would become a lasting reminder of divine power and faithfulness, a monument to the victory that had seemed impossible but had been achieved through supernatural intervention. The effect of this victory would reach far beyond Israel's borders. The nations that had watched the invasion with fear and trembling would witness the complete defeat of what had appeared like an unstoppable force. The demonstration of divine power would be so complete, so overwhelming, so undeniable that it would transform the entire world's understanding of ultimate authority. The emotional effect would be as significant as the military result. The people who had lived in fear of human power would discover that there was a power greater than any earthly force. The rulers who had believed in their own invincibility would learn that their strength was as nothing before the Creator of the universe. The ideologies that had claimed ultimate truth would be revealed as empty philosophies with no power to rescue. The victory would also confirm all of God's previous promises and prophecies. Those who had questioned divine faithfulness would be silenced. Those who had doubted divine power would be answered, and those who had given up hope would be restored. The pattern of divine action throughout history would be confirmed and sealed by this ultimate demonstration. The theological implications would be deep and lasting. The victory over Gog would prove that evil, no matter how powerful it might seem, was ultimately limited and temporary. Good would triumph not through human effort but through divine intervention. The cosmic struggle between light and darkness would be settled decisively in favor of light. The spiritual lessons would be equally meaningful. The victory would demonstrate that divine people were never truly alone, never actually abandoned, never really defenseless. Even when human resources were exhausted and natural possibilities were eliminated, supernatural power remained available. The promise of divine protection would be validated in the most dramatic way possible. The celebration that would follow this victory would be unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The people who had been threatened with extinction would burst into songs of thanksgiving and praise. The mountains would resound with joy, the valleys would echo with laughter, and the very stones would seem to cry out in celebration of divine deliverance. This victory would mark a turning point in world history. The age of human arrogance and rebellion would be concluded, and a new era of divine rule would start. The kingdoms of this world would acknowledge the kingdom of heaven, and the authority of the Creator would be recognized by all creation. The aftermath of Gog's defeat. 7 years of burning. In the silence that came after the great victory, when the dust had settled and the echoes of battle had faded, the practical work of restoration started. The land that had been threatened with destruction now faced the enormous task of purifying itself from the remnants of war. 7 years would pass before the last traces of the invasion would be eliminated. 7 years of patient labor that would transform the instruments of death into the tools of life. The first task was handling the weapons that lay scattered across the landscape. Swords and spears, shields and helmets, bows and arrows, all the implements of war that had been brought for conquest, now served a different purpose. The people of Israel would collect these weapons not as trophies of victory, but as fuel for their daily requirements. The irony was both practical and deep. The metal that had been forged to bring death would now provide warmth for homes. The wood that had been shaped into instruments of violence would now cook food for families. The resources that had been invested in destruction would be redirected toward sustenance and comfort. The 7-year period was long enough to satisfy the nation's fuel requirements completely. No one would need to go into the forests to gather wood. No one would need to cut down trees for burning. The abundance of weaponry would provide for every household, every hearth, every cooking fire. The invasion that had threatened to impoverish the land would instead contribute to its wealth. The process of collection and distribution would become a community effort. Families would work together to collect the weapons. Neighbors would help each other transport the heavy materials. And the entire nation would participate in the transformation of war materials into domestic resources. The work would strengthen social connections and create shared memories of divine deliverance. The burning itself would be a daily reminder of the great victory. Every meal cooked over a fire fed by enemy weapons would recall the moment when divine power had stepped in. Every evening spent warming by a hearth, fueled by invaders' arms, would celebrate the triumph of good over evil. The ordinary acts of daily life would become occasions for remembrance and gratitude. The burial of the dead would be an equally massive undertaking. The valley of Hamon-Gog would become a vast cemetery, a place where the remains of the great army would be laid to rest. The work would require 7 months of intensive effort, with the entire nation participating in the grim but necessary task of restoring the land to purity. Professional searchers would continue the work long after the initial burial was finished. These specialists would search the mountains and valleys, looking for any remains that might have been overlooked. When they discovered bones, they would set up markers so that the burial teams could complete their work. The process would continue until every trace of the invasion had been eliminated. The thoroughness of this purification would be remarkable. Not a single bone would be left unburied, not a single weapon would be left ungathered. The land would be brought back to complete purity, purified from every reminder of the threat that had once appeared so overwhelming. The victory would be followed by total purification. The psychological effect of this extended process would be as important as its practical effects. The 7 years of burning would provide time for the trauma of the invasion to heal. The gradual transformation of weapons into fuel would help the people process their experience of divine deliverance. The daily acts of burning enemy weapons would strengthen their understanding of God's protection. The economic benefits would be substantial. The fuel that would otherwise have cost money and labor would be provided without charge. The 7 years of freedom from gathering firewood would allow the people to focus their energies on other pursuits. The resources that would have been spent on fuel could be invested in rebuilding, in development, in the expansion of prosperity. The environmental effect would also be significant. The forests that might have been cut down for fuel would be preserved. The trees that might have been harvested would continue to grow, providing beauty and habitat for wildlife. The natural resources of the land would be protected through the use of materials that had been intended for destruction. The social aspects of the purification would strengthen community connections. The shared work of collecting weapons and burying the dead would create common experiences and mutual dependencies. The cooperation required for such a massive undertaking would foster unity and solidarity among the people. The spiritual lessons would be equally valuable. The long process of purification would teach patience and thoroughness. The transformation of weapons into fuel would demonstrate divine ability to bring good from evil. The complete purification of the land would illustrate the perfection of divine victory. The symbolic significance would resonate through generations. The 7 years of burning would represent the complete transformation of threat into blessing. The weapons that had been brought to destroy would instead provide for daily needs. The materials of war would be converted into the substances of peace. The testimony to other nations would be powerful and enduring. Visitors to Israel would see the people cooking their food and warming their homes with the weapons of their former enemies. The practical evidence of divine victory would be visible in every household, tangible in every meal, experienced in every moment of comfort and warmth. The completion of the purification would mark the end of an era. When the last weapon had been burned and the last bone had been buried, the land would be ready for a new chapter in its history. The threat would be not just defeated, but completely erased, leaving room for the full flowering of divine blessing and promise. A New Temple Vision, Part 1, The Return of Glory. 25 years into the exile, on the 10th day of the first month, in the 14th year after Jerusalem's fall, Ezekiel felt the familiar weight of divine presence settling upon him. This wasn't the severe hand of condemnation that characterized his previous visions. Rather, something altogether different touched him now. A tender yet profound sensation of homecoming washed over him. The presence of the Lord rested upon him, yet this occasion carried him away from scenes of devastation toward visions focused on renewal and healing. The transportation happened in an instant, utterly complete. In one breath, he stood alongside the displaced community beside Babylon's waterways. In the next, he discovered himself positioned within Israel's territory, placed atop an exceptionally elevated mountain peak. From this lofty vantage point, his eyes fell upon something that sent his heart soaring with amazement and delight. The skeletal structure of a city emerged from the southern skyline, its fortifications radiant in heaven's illumination. This wasn't the devastated Jerusalem that lay in ruins. This wasn't the sanctuary that flames had consumed and enemies had demolished. This represented something entirely fresh, something far more magnificent, something embodying every aspiration and vision that had sustained his community throughout their years living as captives. The vision possessed such clarity, such intricate detail, such flawlessness, that it appeared more substantial than the material world he'd departed. A being materialized at his side, a man whose countenance resembled bronze, grasping a line for measuring and a rod for taking measurements within his hand. This clearly wasn't any typical mortal being, but rather a heavenly messenger dispatched to guide the prophet through the marvels about to unfold before him. The bronze-like features suggested durability and steadfastness, while the measuring instruments indicated exactness and deliberate planning. The messenger's initial words established the vision's intent. "Son of man, observe with your eyes and listen with your ears. Fix your attention on all that I reveal to you, for you've been transported here so these things might be shown to you. Announce to Israel's house everything your eyes witness." This wasn't simply a private encounter, but rather a communication meant for sharing, an encouragement meant for delivering, an assurance meant for declaring. The tour commenced at the temple complex's exterior walls. These weren't the humble perimeters of Solomon's sanctuary, but rather enormous structures conveying divine magnificence and perpetual security. The walls exhibited flawless proportions, their elevation and breadth carefully determined to deliver both aesthetic appeal and defensive strength. Every measurement demonstrated precision, every corner achieved perfection. Every aspect was fashioned with divine craftsmanship. The gates stood as architectural and symbolic wonders. Each entrance constituted an artistic masterpiece, adorned with engraved figures and valuable materials. The threshold, the entrance hall, the chambers, all were fashioned not merely for utility, but for aesthetic beauty, not simply for passage, but for devotion. These were gates befitting the king above all kings, entrances suitable for the Almighty's presence. The courtyards expanded in concentric rectangular patterns, each tier representing varying degrees of sacredness. The exterior court accommodated the community, the interior court the priestly class, and the innermost sacred areas the divine presence itself. The movement from ordinary to consecrated was distinguished by escalating beauty, increasingly valuable materials, and increasingly intricate artistry. The chambers and rooms proved abundant and diverse, each fashioned for particular functions within the temple's devotional and operational life. Storage chambers for the contributions, quarters for priestly lodging, preparation zones for the sacrificial offerings. Every dimension of temple existence had been contemplated and accommodated. Nothing remained to chance, nothing went overlooked. The measurements received extraordinarily detailed attention, as though the prophet were viewing the architect's blueprints for a structure destined for actual construction. The exact dimensions, the precise proportions, the meticulous specifications, all indicated this wasn't merely symbolic imagery, but a design for future reality. The most striking characteristic was the progressive revelation of mounting sacredness. As the tour advanced, each step penetrating further into the temple's interior unveiled enhanced beauty, increasingly precious materials, increasingly complex ornamentation. The advancement resembled ascending a mountain of devotion, each tier elevating the spirit higher toward the divine presence. The priests destined to minister in this sanctuary received careful, detailed description. Their vestments, their responsibilities, their credentials, all were outlined with exactness. These weren't simply religious officials, but representatives of a consecrated community, intermediaries between earthly and heavenly realms, servants of the most exalted God. The sacrificial order was delineated with comparable attention. The altars, the rituals, the contributions, all were portrayed as though already functioning. The blood of cattle and goats would flow once more. The smoke from burnt sacrifices would ascend once more. The petitions of the community would rise once more toward the throne of divine favor. Yet the most crucial moment remained ahead. As the tour approached its pinnacle, as the prophet was shown the temple's innermost sanctuary, the glory of the Lord commenced its return. This was the instant that rendered all the displacement worthwhile, the sight that validated all the suffering, the vision that converted all the anguish into meaning. The glory approached from the eastern direction, the identical path from which it had withdrawn years earlier. Yet this homecoming differed from the departure. Where the leaving had been gradual and hesitant, characterized by divine sorrow over human transgression, the return was rapid and jubilant, characterized by divine satisfaction in accomplished restoration. The sound of the approaching glory resembled the sound of abundant waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of a vast army. It was the sound of heaven descending to earth, of the divine presence readying itself to inhabit humanity's midst once more. The atmosphere itself seemed to pulse with expectation as the moment of reunion drew near. The earth itself responded to the approaching glory. The terrain quaked, the mountains shuddered, and the temple's very foundations seemed to celebrate the return of their rightful occupant. Creation itself was commemorating the homecoming of its creator. When the glory at last penetrated the temple, saturating it as water saturates a container, the vision reached its apex. The house was permeated with the glory of the Lord, and the prophet collapsed face down in worship and wonder. This was the instant that rendered all the anticipation worthwhile, the sight that validated all the faith, the encounter that transformed all the expectation into reality. A New Temple Vision, Part 2, Sacred Geometry. The bronze guide's measuring rod moves with mathematical exactness. Each dimension unveils deeper layers of significance. The temple complex unfolds like a sacred formula where every number conveys spiritual meaning. The geometry communicates in heaven's language, translating divine arrangement into earthly expression. The exterior court forms a flawless square, 500 cubits along each edge. The number conveys wholeness, divine favor multiplied by human obligation. Within this square, smaller rectangular shapes organize the various chambers and corridors. The pattern replicates at differing scales, generating harmony through balanced proportion. The interior court measures 100 cubits square. The decrease from the exterior court follows divine calculations. From 500 to 100, from the multitude to the select few, from the broad to the particular, the advancement draws the devotee inward toward increasing consecration. The altar rests at the exact center of the interior court. Its positioning isn't coincidental but intentional. From this location, all additional measurements extend outward. The altar becomes the geometric center of the complex, the anchored point around which all devotion rotates. The temple structure itself measures 60 cubits in length and 20 cubits in breadth. The ratio of 3:1 manifests throughout Scripture in contexts of divine intervention. The vessel that preserved Noah's household, the dimensions of Solomon's sanctuary. The pattern recurs here with eternal import. The temple's elevation reaches 30 cubits. The number 30 emerges at pivotal moments throughout biblical narrative. The age when priests commenced their ministry, the silver pieces that betrayed the Messiah, the years of Jesus' concealed existence. The elevation connects this future sanctuary to the broader narrative of redemption. The bronze guide clarifies the importance of each measurement. The eastern gate's threshold measures 6 cubits. 6, humanity's number, represents those approaching God's presence. Yet the gate itself measures 25 cubits, 5 multiplied by 5, grace heaped upon grace for those who pass through. The chambers lining the gates each measure 6 cubits by 6 cubits. The square configuration represents flawlessness, fulfillment, divine arrangement imposed on human territory. 6 chambers on each flank create the number 12, indicating the complete assembly of Israel gathered for devotion. The interior court's gates reflect the exterior court's design, yet with altered proportions. The threshold measures 10 cubits, the number of divine completeness. The chambers measure 10 by 12, merging divine arrangement with human structure. The advancement from 6 to 10 to 12 narrates the story of spiritual development. The steps ascending to each gate follow deliberate calculation. 7 steps ascend to the exterior court, 8 to the interior court, 10 to the temple structure. The ascending numbers represent the soul's pilgrimage toward divine presence. Each step demands greater commitment, more profound consecration. The Bronze Guide unveils the deeper significance of these advancements. 7 represents fulfillment in the natural realm. 8 speaks of fresh beginnings, of resurrection existence. 10 signifies divine flawlessness. The steps become a spiritual stairway, each tier demanding greater dedication. The windows in the temple walls follow exact geometric configurations. They're positioned in groups of 3, representing the trinity of divine characteristics. Their proportions create golden rectangles, configurations that manifest throughout nature when divine arrangement expresses itself in creation. The pillars supporting the temple roof stand at deliberately calculated intervals. Their spacing generates acoustic characteristics that amplify the human voice in melody and petition. The geometry serves not only aesthetic appeal, but practical function, rendering the temple a flawless instrument for devotion. The Bronze Guide measures the wall's thickness with particular attention. The exterior walls measure 6 cubits thick, delivering strength without excessive mass. The interior walls measure 4 cubits, diminishing the bulk as the spaces become more consecrated. The advancement from thick to thin represents the soul's transition from earthly to celestial preoccupations. The decorative elements follow geometric principles equally. The cherubim engraved on the walls stand in flawless symmetry. The palm trees alternating with them generate rhythmic configurations that guide the eye heavenward. The spacing between decorative elements follows mathematical ratios, generating visual harmony. The Bronze Guide clarifies how these configurations mirror divine character. God creates through number and balanced proportion. The universe itself follows mathematical principles, reflecting the divine intellect. The temple becomes a microcosm of creation, embodying identical principles governing celestial bodies and seasonal cycles. The temple complex's water system demonstrates functional geometry. Channels carved into the stone floors transport away the blood from sacrifices. The gradual incline ensures adequate drainage while preserving the sacred nature of the space. Engineering serves devotion without compromising aesthetic appeal. The Bronze Guide reveals the deeper mystery of the temple's directional alignment. The structure faces eastward toward the ascending sun, toward the territory of Israel's origins. The alignment connects the temple to cosmic patterns, to the daily rhythm of illumination and shadow governing human existence. The courtyards create acoustic spaces, amplifying sound organically. The enclosure's proportions enhance the human voice without echo or distortion. Thousands can assemble for devotion and hear with clarity. The geometry serves the practical requirements of congregational devotion. The Bronze Guide indicates how the measurements relate to the human form. The cubit derives from the forearm's length. The temple is constructed to human scale, yet elevated beyond human limitation. The structure embraces humanity while lifting it toward divinity. The distances between elements create processional pathways, guiding movement through the complex. The geometry channels the flow of devotees, preventing disorder while maintaining reverence. The temple teaches proper approach to the divine through its very arrangement. The Bronze Guide demonstrates how the temple's proportions manifest in miniature throughout the complex. The identical ratios governing the entire structure manifest in individual chambers. The configuration replicates at every scale, generating unity through variation. The temple's foundation follows geometric principles, ensuring stability. The stones are carved to exact angles, distributing weight uniformly. The geometry serves structural soundness while maintaining aesthetic harmony. Beauty and strength unite in divine proportion. The Bronze Guide clarifies how the temple's geometry connects to celestial movements. The proportions mirror the relationships between planets and celestial bodies. The structure becomes an earthly reflection of heavenly arrangement, a location where cosmic harmony discovers architectural expression. The measuring process reveals the temple as an instructional instrument. Each dimension conveys theological import. The proportions educate the devotee about divine character. The geometry becomes a mode of revelation, communicating truth through mathematical beauty. The bronze guide's rod finally rests as the final measurement is documented. The temple complex stands fulfilled in vision, every dimension determined, every proportion flawless. The sacred geometry creates a space worthy of divine habitation, a location where heaven and earth converge in mathematical harmony. A new temple vision, Part 3. Holy worship restored. The bronze guide sets aside his measuring rod. The architectural examination is fulfilled, yet the temple's authentic purpose resides not in its measurements, but in its ministry. The structure exists to accommodate devotion, to supply a location where heaven and earth intersect in sacred ministry. The guide leads Ezekiel to observe the priesthood's restoration. Men approach the temple wearing linen vestments, gleaming white in the morning illumination. These aren't the compromised priests of the fallen sanctuary, but a purified order cleansed for ministry in the new holy place. The priests move with practiced elegance through their responsibilities. They kindle the fire upon the altar with reverent attention. The flames spring upward, bearing the sweet aroma of burning sacrifices toward heaven. The smoke ascends vertically in the calm air, unobstructed by wind or atmospheric conditions. The guide clarifies the new regulations for priestly ministry. Only Zadok's descendants may approach the altar. These families remained faithful when others descended into corruption. Their loyalty throughout the dark years earned them the privilege of ministry in the restored sanctuary. The priestly vestments follow ancient configurations, yet with fresh import. Linen tunics, linen undergarments, linen headwear. No wool contacts their bodies during their ministry. The fabric speaks of purity, of plant existence rather than animal mortality. The priests become living symbols of resurrection. The guide indicates the attention with which the priests prepare for ministry. They cleanse their hands and feet before penetrating the interior court. They exchange their vestments when transitioning between sacred and ordinary areas. Every aspect reflects the holiness of the space they minister within. The daily sacrifices resume their ancient pattern. Morning and evening, the priests present lambs upon the altar. The regular sacrifice generates a heartbeat of devotion, pulsing through each day. The sacrifices speak of reliance, of thanksgiving, of the requirement for divine acceptance. The guide clarifies how the sacrifices differ from the former sanctuary. The emphasis transitions from guilt to thanksgiving, from atonement to commemoration. The sacrifices acknowledge past redemption rather than pursue future forgiveness. The blood has already been poured out. These sacrifices remember and honor that sacrifice. The priests commence their instruction of the community. They teach the distinction between clean and unclean, sacred and ordinary. Their words possess authority supported by divine appointment. The community listens with hunger for guidance, grateful for clear direction, following years of uncertainty. The guide unveils the deeper intent of this instruction. The priests don't simply enforce regulations, but reveal principles. They assist the community in understanding how to exist in the Holy One's presence. Their teaching transforms external observance into internal transformation. The Levites return to their supporting functions with gladness. They minister as guards and gatekeepers, maintaining order within the temple complex. Their ministry, though less central than the priests, possesses equal dignity. Every function in the temple contributes to the whole. The guide clarifies the economic structure supporting the temple ministry. The priests receive portions of the sacrifices as their inheritance. The territory provides for their requirements through the tithes and contributions of the community. The structure ensures those who minister at the altar derive their sustenance from the altar. The festival calendar resumes its ancient rhythm: Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. Each commemoration brings the community together in communal devotion. The festivals mark the seasons of spiritual existence, generating rhythm and anticipation in the community's experience. The guide indicates how the festivals connect to the temple's topography. Different commemorations utilize different areas of the complex. The movement of the community through the sacred spaces generates a choreography of devotion, engaging both body and spirit. The community's prince assumes his designated function in the temple ministry. He supplies sacrifices for the festivals and the daily offerings. His participation represents the entire community, bridging the distance between ruler and ruled through shared devotion. The guide clarifies the prince's restrictions alongside his privileges. He enters through particular gates and stands in appointed locations. His authority extends to secular matters, yet in the temple he joins the ordinary devotees in humility before God. The community's function in devotion receives careful attention. They bring their sacrifices with gladness rather than compulsion. They participate in the festivals with commemoration rather than mere obligation. The restored devotion reflects hearts transformed by divine favor. The guide unveils how the community's devotion connects to their daily existence. The principles learned in the temple guide their behavior in the marketplace. The reverence, cultivated in sacred space, influences their treatment of household and neighbors. The temple music returns with fresh power. Singers and musicians assume their positions in the complex. Their voices blend in harmonies, seeming to echo from heaven itself. The music elevates the hearts of the devotees and bears their petitions upward. The guide clarifies how the music serves the broader intent of devotion. The melodies teach theological truths mere words cannot express. The rhythms generate unity among the diverse congregation. The harmonies reflect the arrangement and beauty of divine character. The petitions offered in the temple follow fresh configurations. Where once supplication dominated, now thanksgiving prevails. Where once fear-motivated approach to God, now love draws the community forward. The petitions reflect the transformation of the devotees' hearts. The guide indicates how the petitions connect to the temple's design. The acoustic characteristics of the structure ensure petitions spoken softly reach the ears of those standing nearby. The architecture serves the community's requirement for corporate petition. The guide unveils the eternal import of this restored devotion. The temple ministry on earth reflects the devotion continuing in heaven. The priests and community participate in a cosmic liturgy, transcending time and space. Their devotion joins the eternal song of the redeemed. The holiness saturating the temple begins to radiate outward. The community who worships there carries something of the sacred into their daily existence. The community surrounding the temple reflects the character of the God dwelling within it. The guide clarifies how this restored devotion fulfills ancient assurances. The temple becomes what it was always intended to be, a house of petition for all peoples. The devotion offered there blesses not only Israel, but all peoples seeking the true God. The bronze guide's instruction concludes with a vision of what lies ahead. The devotion restored in the temple will persist forever. The ministry established there will never again face interruption. The community ministering there will serve in God's presence throughout eternity. A new land, the reapportioned inheritance. The bronze guide leads Ezekiel to an elevated location overlooking the transformed landscape. Israel's territory spreads before them, yet this isn't the familiar terrain of ancient tribal territories. The old divisions have been erased, replaced by a fresh arrangement reflecting divine fairness rather than historical circumstance. The guide begins to trace the fresh boundaries with his rod. The territory divides into parallel strips, extending east to west. Each strip represents the inheritance of one among the 12 tribes. The uniform width of each portion speaks of equity, of God's impartial love for all his community. The northern boundary starts at the Mediterranean waters and extends to the eastern wilderness. Dan receives the initial portion, the tribe that once wandered far from its original inheritance. The restoration gives them a position of honor, demonstrating that divine mercy reaches even the most wayward children. Asher receives the second strip, followed by Naphtali. These northern tribes, frequently threatened by foreign invasion, now enjoy security behind the fresh boundaries. Their portions stretch from sea to wilderness, granting them access to both maritime commerce and pastoral territories. The guide clarifies the importance of the east-west orientation. The old tribal boundaries followed geographical characteristics, generating irregular configurations that sometimes disadvantaged certain tribes. The fresh arrangement ensures equal access to diverse resources. From coastal plains to mountain highlands to wilderness grazing territories, Manasseh claims the fourth portion, reunited with its eastern half that once lived beyond the Jordan. The division weakening this tribe in ancient times is healed. The restored unity speaks of God's desire to repair what history has fractured. Ephraim follows in the fifth strip, the tribe that once dominated the northern kingdom. Their central positioning provides access to the major trade routes crossing the territory. The positioning acknowledges their natural leadership qualities while preventing the favoritism once causing division. Reuben receives the sixth portion, restored to honor despite ancient transgressions. The tribe, losing its birthright through moral compromise, finds redemption in the fresh arrangement. Their placement speaks of second chances, of divine favor that overwrites human transgression. The guide pauses at the seventh strip, the most important division in the fresh territory. This central portion belongs neither to any tribe nor to any individual. Instead, it forms the holy district, the sacred space housing the temple, the city, and the priests. This holy district measures 25,000 cubits from north to south and extends the full width of the territory from east to west. The enormous dimension reflects the importance of devotion in the restored community. The sacred takes precedence over the secular in the fresh arrangement. Within the holy district, exact divisions generate order and intent. The northern section belongs to the priests ministering in the temple. Their inheritance consists not of farmland, but of proximity to the sanctuary. They receive the greatest treasure, constant access to the divine presence. The Levites receive the section south of the priests. Their portion equals the priests in dimension, acknowledging their vital function in temple ministry. Though they cannot approach the altar, they participate fully in the sacred work of maintaining God's house. The city occupies the southern section of the holy district. This fresh Jerusalem measures considerably smaller than the old capital, yet its import far exceeds its dimension. The city exists to serve the temple, not to dominate it. The proper relationship between religious and civic authority is restored. The guide unveils the dimensions of the fresh city. It forms a flawless square, 4,500 cubits on each edge. The geometric flawlessness speaks of divine arrangement imposed on human habitation. The city becomes a reflection of heavenly harmony, a location where peace and fairness dwell together. The prince receives territory on both flanks of the holy district. His portion extends from the Mediterranean waters to the eastern border, granting him considerable resources. Yet his inheritance is defined by its relationship to the sacred space. Even royal power serves the purposes of devotion. The guide clarifies how this arrangement prevents the corruption plaguing the old monarchy. The prince cannot claim ownership of the temple or authority over the priests. His wealth comes from his own territories, not from confiscating sacred property. The separation of powers protects both religious and civic integrity. South of the holy district, the remaining tribes receive their portions. Judah claims the strip immediately adjacent to the sacred space. The tribe, giving its name to the community and providing the Davidic line, receives the honor of proximity to the temple. Benjamin follows Judah. the small tribe remaining loyal to David's house. Their faithfulness during the divided kingdom earns them a position of honor near the sacred center. The positioning rewards past loyalty while promising future blessing. Simeon receives the next portion, the tribe once facing judgment for violence. Their inheritance in the fresh territory speaks of restoration, of divine mercy transforming character. The scattered tribe finds unity in their defined borders. Issachar claims the next strip, the tribe known for understanding the times. Their strategic position allows them to continue their function as advisors and interpreters. The territory grant acknowledges their intellectual contributions to the community. Zebulun receives the next portion, the tribe associated with maritime trade. Their access to both sea and land routes enables them to continue their commercial activities. The inheritance builds on their natural strengths while providing fresh opportunities. The guide indicates how each tribal portion reflects the character and calling of its community. The assignments aren't arbitrary but purposeful, designed to maximize each tribe's contribution to the whole. The territory division becomes a form of divine guidance for community structure. Gad receives the southernmost portion, the tribe once choosing inheritance east of the Jordan. Their fresh position in the main body of the territory integrates them fully into the community. The geographic separation, sometimes isolating them, is ended. The guide clarifies the practical benefits of this fresh arrangement. The parallel strips generate natural boundaries, preventing territorial disputes. The equal access to diverse resources eliminates the economic inequalities, once causing jealousy between tribes. The fresh boundaries also serve defensive purposes. Each tribe's territory extends from the Mediterranean to the wilderness, making invasion difficult. An enemy cannot attack one tribe without facing the united response of all 12. The geography encourages cooperation rather than isolation. The guide unveils how the territory distribution reflects divine fairness. The tribes remaining faithful during the displacement received no special advantage over those falling away. The restoration offers equal opportunity to all, demonstrating that divine mercy transcends human transgression. The inheritance structure ensures the territory remains within tribal households. The Jubilee laws prevent permanent alienation of property. The economic provisions protect the poor while rewarding industry. The social arrangement reflects divine values rather than merely human preferences. The guide clarifies how the fresh boundaries facilitate devotion. The central positioning of the holy district makes it accessible to all tribes. The regular festivals will draw community from every corner of the territory. The geography serves the spiritual requirements of the community. The water rights receive careful attention in the fresh arrangement. The major rivers flow through multiple tribal territories, ensuring no group controls essential resources. The sharing of water reflects the sharing of divine blessing among all the community. The guide indicates how the territory division teaches theological truths. The equality of the tribal portions demonstrates divine impartiality. The central positioning of the holy district shows the priority of devotion. The prince's position illustrates the proper relationship between authority and ministry. The fresh arrangement also provides for the stranger and the sojourner. Foreigners joining themselves to the Lord receive inheritance alongside native-born Israelites. The territory opens its arms to all seeking the true God, reflecting divine hospitality. The guide clarifies how this generous policy fulfills ancient assurances. The territory becomes a blessing to all peoples, not just to Israel. The inclusion of foreigners in the inheritance demonstrates the universal reach of divine favor. The boundaries of the fresh territory extend beyond the traditional limits of Israel. The territory reaches from the entrance of Hamath in the north to the Book of Egypt in the south. The expanded borders reflect the enlarged vision of the restored community. The guide unveils the eternal import of this territory division. The boundaries established here will endure forever. The inheritances assigned to each tribe will never again be lost. The community will dwell securely in their appointed locations throughout all generations. The river from the temple. Life flows out. The bronze guide leads Ezekiel back to the temple, yet this occasion they approach from the south flank. Something fresh captures the prophet's attention. Water trickles from beneath the temple's threshold, flowing eastward toward the ascending sun. The stream appears modest, barely sufficient to moisten the feet of those crossing it. The guide steps into the shallow water, his measuring rod in hand. He walks eastward for 1,000 cubits, then pauses to measure the depth. The water reaches his ankles. A gentle current speaks of hidden sources. The stream has grown deeper, though no tributaries have joined it. They continue eastward another 1,000 cubits. The guide measures again, and now the water reaches his knees. The increase seems impossible by natural principles. The stream draws its power from supernatural springs, from the very presence of God saturating the temple behind them. Another 1,000 cubits brings them to water reaching the waist. The current grows stronger, carrying the sound of distant thunder. The guide's movements become more careful as he navigates the deepening flow. The stream is becoming a river, fed by invisible sources. At the fourth measurement, the water has become too deep to cross. The stream has transformed into a mighty river, its far bank visible yet unreachable. The guide sets aside his measuring rod, acknowledging some things transcend human ability to measure. The river flows with divine life that cannot be contained. The guide clarifies the mystery of this water. It flows from the sanctuary where God dwells, carrying the very essence of divine life. Every drop contains healing power. Every ripple bears the potential for transformation. The river is not merely water, but liquid grace, flowing toward a world thirsting for restoration. They follow the riverbank eastward, watching as the water carves a channel through the landscape. The current moves with intent, seeking the lowest locations, filling the empty spaces. The river demonstrates divine favor in action, reaching toward those most needing its touch. The path leads them through the wilderness, stretching between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. This barren region has known little life, its soil too salty for cultivation, its climate too harsh for habitation. Yet the river flows through it without diminishing, bringing hope to the hopeless locations. Fish appear in the water, swimming upstream against the current. Their presence seems impossible in this desert stream, yet they multiply as the guide and Ezekiel watch. The river creates its own ecosystem, supporting life where none existed before. The fish become living proof of the water's power. The guide indicates the trees beginning to line the riverbank. They grow with supernatural speed, their roots reaching deep into the life-giving water. The species are unlike any found in the surrounding wilderness. They flourish in the river's presence, drawing sustenance from its flow. The leaves of these trees never wither, remaining green through all seasons. The guide clarifies their unique property. They provide nourishment for the hungry and medicine for the sick. Each tree becomes a pharmacy and a restaurant, offering exactly what those approaching it need. The fruit of these trees ripens continuously, providing a harvest every month. The abundance speaks of divine generosity, of resources never failing. The trees demonstrate how proximity to God's presence creates inexhaustible blessing. The river continues its journey toward the Dead Sea, that body of water so saturated with salt, nothing can survive in it. The sea has stood as a symbol of death for countless generations, its waters too bitter for any creature to survive. Yet the river flows toward it without hesitation. At the sea's edge, the river enters the lifeless water. The guide watches as the transformation commences. The salt content diminishes where the river touches the sea. The bitter water becomes sweet. The hostile environment becomes hospitable. Life conquers death through the power of the flowing stream. Fish appear in the formerly dead water, their numbers multiplying rapidly. The guide counts species unknown in these regions, creatures reflecting the diversity of divine creation. The sea becomes a living ecosystem, teeming with activity where once only silence reigned. Fishermen appear along the shores, casting their nets into the now living water. Their catches exceed their expectations, the nets heavy with the abundance of fresh life. The guide clarifies these fishermen come from far and wide, drawn by reports of the miraculous transformation. The transformation spreads outward from the point where the river enters the sea. The living water gradually conquers the dead, changing the very character of the vast body of water. The Dead Sea dies to its former nature and is reborn as a sea of life. The guide indicates areas where the old salt water remains unchanged. These marshes and shallow locations retain their former character, continuing to provide salt for human use. The transformation is thorough yet not total, preserving what serves humanity while eliminating what destroys. The river's influence extends beyond the water itself. The territory along its banks becomes fertile, supporting agriculture in regions once knowing only barrenness. Crops grow with unusual vigor, their roots drawing life from the underground, streams feeding the river. Cities spring up along the river's course, their inhabitants drawn by the abundance of water and the fertility of the territory. The guide clarifies, these aren't ordinary settlements, but communities organized around the principles of divine fairness and mercy. The river serves as a highway for trade and communication. Boats navigate its waters, transporting goods and passengers between the temple and the sea. The waterway becomes a lifeline, connecting the sacred center to the wider world. The guide unveils the deeper significance of the river's journey. It represents the flow of divine blessing from the temple to the ends of the earth. The water carries God's presence beyond the boundaries of the holy territory, bringing life to all who receive it. The river's course defies natural topography, flowing uphill when necessary to reach those needing its touch. The water demonstrates divine favor, operates by different principles than earthly physics. Love finds a way where logic sees only obstacles. The guide clarifies how the river fulfills ancient prophecies. The streams flowing from Eden, the water flowing from Jerusalem, the river making glad the city of God. All these assurances find their fulfillment in the temple's life-giving flow. The seasonal patterns of the river remain constant throughout the year. Drought cannot diminish its flow. Flood cannot overwhelm its banks. The water provides reliable abundance, demonstrating the faithfulness of its divine source. The guide indicates how the river serves as a boundary between territories in the fresh territory. Yet it's a boundary uniting rather than dividing, providing blessing to all living along its banks. The water creates community rather than separation. The river's mouth at the sea becomes a location of pilgrimage. Community journey from distant territories to witness the transformation, to observe death conquered by life. The site becomes a testimony to divine power spreading throughout the known world. The guide clarifies this river isn't unique, but represents the pattern of divine blessing. Wherever God's presence dwells, life flows outward to touch the surrounding world. The Temple River demonstrates principles applying to every location where the divine and human meet. The gates of the city, a fresh name for Jerusalem. The bronze guide leads Ezekiel to the outskirts of the fresh city. The settlement serving the temple spreads before them, its walls gleaming in the afternoon illumination. This is Jerusalem, transformed. A city bearing the same name as the ancient capital, yet embodying entirely fresh principles. The city forms a flawless square, its geometry reflecting divine arrangement. Each side measures exactly 4,500 cubits, generating a sense of balance and harmony. The proportions speak of careful planning, of architecture serving both practical and spiritual purposes. 12 gates pierce the city walls, 3 on each side. The guide clarifies their import. Each gate bears the name of one among the 12 tribes of Israel. The city welcomes all of God's community equally, with no tribe receiving preference or suffering exclusion. The eastern wall contains the gates of Joseph, Benjamin, and Dan. These tribes receive the honor of facing the temple, their gates opening toward the source of divine blessing. The positioning acknowledges their special relationship to the sacred center. The northern wall bears the gates of Reuben, Judah, and Levi. Reuben's gate speaks of restoration, Judah's of kingship, Levi's of priesthood. The three fundamental aspects of Israel's calling find representation in the city's northern approach. The southern wall contains the gates of Simeon, Issachar, and Zebulun. These tribes, once scattered or diminished, now receive equal honor with their brothers. The gates demonstrate divine favor, transforms past transgressions into present glory. The western wall holds the gates of Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. These tribes from the frontiers of the territory now enjoy security within the city's embrace. The gates speak of protection, of a safe haven for those once facing constant danger. The guide clarifies the deeper significance of the 12 gates. They represent the 12 months of the year, the 12 signs of the zodiac, the 12 stones in the high priest's breastplate. The city becomes a microcosm of creation, embracing all of time and space. Each gate is constructed from a single pearl, glowing with inner illumination. The material speaks of beauty born from irritation, of precious things created through pressure and time. The gates remind all entering that divine favor transforms suffering into glory. The walls themselves are constructed of jasper, transparent as crystal. The stone allows illumination to pass through while maintaining strength. The transparency speaks of honesty, of a city with nothing to conceal. The walls protect without hiding. The foundations of the walls rest on 12 precious stones, each one representing one among the 12 apostles. The New Testament Church joins with the Old Testament tribes in supporting the city's structure. The foundation stones demonstrate the continuity of divine intent through the ages. The guide indicates the inscriptions above each gate. They contain not only tribal names but also blessings and assurances. Each entrance speaks words of welcome, of hope, of divine favor. The gates become preaching stations proclaiming truth to all passing through. The width of each gate allows comfortable passage of large crowds. The openings are designed to accommodate the festivals when thousands will stream into the city. The architecture serves the practical requirements of congregational devotion. Guards stand at each gate, yet their function is ministry rather than restriction. They assist visitors in finding their way, answer questions about the city's customs, provide assistance to those in need. The guards embody the city's character of hospitality and favor. The guide clarifies the import of the gate's perpetual opening. They never close, day or night, summer or winter. The city offers constant access to all seeking its blessings. The open gates demonstrate divine availability, God's readiness to receive all who come. The streets of the city are paved with gold, transparent as glass. The precious metal speaks of the city's value, while its transparency reveals the absence of hidden corruption. The streets literally shine with divine glory, illuminating the way for all walking them. The guide unveils that the city contains no temple structure. The entire settlement serves as a sanctuary, with every street and structure dedicated to holy purposes. The distinction between sacred and secular disappears in the city's transformed atmosphere. The river flowing from the temple runs through the middle of the city's main street. The water brings life to every district, ensuring no area lacks the blessing of divine presence. The river becomes the city's central characteristic, its source of vitality. The tree of life grows along the riverbank, its branches extending over the water. The fruit provides nourishment for the city's inhabitants, while the leaves offer healing for the peoples. The tree demonstrates this city serves not only Israel, but all humanity. The guide clarifies the city's population. It includes not only the descendants of the 12 tribes, but also foreigners who have joined themselves to the Lord. The city embraces diversity while maintaining unity, reflecting the inclusive character of divine favor. The government of the city operates on principles of fairness and mercy. Leaders are chosen for their wisdom and integrity rather than their wealth or connections. The administration ministers to the community rather than ruling over them, embodying the servant leadership God desires. The guide indicates the absence of certain characteristics common to earthly cities. No military barracks occupy space within the walls, for the city's defense comes from divine protection. No prisons mar the landscape, for the transformed hearts of the inhabitants eliminate crime. The economy of the city operates on principles of sharing and generosity. No one lacks necessities, while no one hoards luxuries. The abundance flowing from the temple river ensures all requirements are met without strain or anxiety. The guide unveils the city's function as a center of learning. Schools and libraries line the streets, preserving the wisdom of the ages while exploring fresh truth. The city becomes a fountain of knowledge, sending teachers and scholars throughout the world. The artistic life of the city reflects its spiritual character. Musicians compose melodies lifting the heart toward heaven. Craftsmen create objects serving both beauty and function. Writers record the testimonies of those experiencing divine favor. The guide clarifies how the city serves as a model for human habitation. Its principles of fairness, mercy, and love demonstrate how communities can function when divine wisdom guides their structure. The city becomes an illumination to the peoples, showing God's desire for human society. The climate of the city remains temperate throughout the year. The extreme heat of summer and the harsh cold of winter are moderated by the divine presence saturating the settlement. The weather serves human comfort rather than challenging human endurance. The guide indicates how the city's design facilitates relationships. The arrangement encourages interaction between neighbors while providing privacy for households. The architecture serves community while respecting individuality. The guide unveils the city's eternal character. Unlike earthly settlements rising and falling, this city will endure forever. Its inhabitants will never face displacement or destruction. The permanence of the city reflects the faithfulness of the God who established it. The name of the city becomes clear as the vision approaches its culmination. Jerusalem is no longer called by its ancient name, but receives a fresh title describing its true character. The guide speaks the name with reverence. The Lord is there. Ezekiel's legacy. Strange prophet, enduring vision. The bronze guide begins to fade as the vision draws to its close. Ezekiel finds himself alone on the mountain, the architectural wonders dissolving into memory. Yet the images burned into his mind remain vivid, demanding to be shared with those waiting in displacement for word of hope. The prophet descends from the heights, carrying within him the blueprint for restoration. His steps are measured, his bearing transformed by what he has witnessed. The man who once ate bread mixed with dung now walks with the dignity of one who has seen divine glory return to earth. The displaced community gathers around him as news spreads of his return. Their faces reflect years of disappointment, of assurances unfulfilled and expectations deferred. They have heard prophetic words before, seen visions seeming to fade with morning illumination. Yet something in Ezekiel's manner suggests this occasion is different. The prophet begins to speak, his words careful and exact. He describes the measurements of the temple, the dimensions of the courts, the arrangement of the chambers. His attention to detail convinces the listeners he has seen something real, something substantial enough to be constructed with human hands. The architectural vision captures their imagination first. They are practical community, skilled in construction and craftsmanship. The temple plans give them something concrete to consider, blueprints their minds can grasp and their hands could execute. The vision becomes tangible through its specifications. Yet Ezekiel moves beyond mere measurements to describe the river flowing from the temple. His words paint pictures of life conquering death, of water bringing fertility to barren locations. The displaced lean forward, hungry for hope, transcending their current circumstances. The prophet tells of the fresh city with its 12 gates, each bearing a tribal name. The listeners hear their own identities affirmed, their own locations secured in the divine plan. The city welcomes all of Israel's children, healing the divisions, plaguing the community for generations. Some among the displaced question the feasibility of Ezekiel's vision. They point to the political realities making such restoration seem impossible. The Babylonian Empire shows no signs of releasing its captives. The Persian successors appear equally determined to maintain authority. Where will the power come from to construct such a temple? Ezekiel responds with patient clarification. The vision comes from God, not from human planning. The restoration will unfold according to divine timing, not political convenience. The prophet's task is to preserve the vision, to keep it alive in the hearts of the community until the moment of fulfillment arrives. The more thoughtful among the displaced begin to understand Ezekiel's vision serves multiple purposes. It provides hope for eventual return, yet also offers principles for present living. The temple's holiness can be reflected in their current communities. The city's fairness can guide their current relationships. The prophet's reputation spreads beyond the immediate displaced community. Other peoples hear of the Hebrew prophet seeing visions of restoration. Some dismiss him as a dreamer, yet others recognize the power of his words. The vision begins to influence how community think about divine presence and human community. Ezekiel's strange prophetic methods suddenly make sense in light of his final vision. The street theater, the symbolic actions, the bizarre object lessons, all were preparing his audience for this moment. The prophet who acted out destruction now proclaims reconstruction with equal dramatic power. The influence of Ezekiel's vision extends far beyond his own lifetime. Later generations of Jews returning from displacement carry his blueprints in their minds. The temple they construct may not match his specifications exactly, yet his vision guides their understanding of what sacred space should accomplish. The prophet's emphasis on divine holiness shapes Jewish thinking for centuries. The careful distinctions between clean and unclean, sacred and ordinary, become central to Jewish identity. Ezekiel's vision provides the theological framework for a community learning to live in God's presence. The Christian church discovers in Ezekiel's vision previews of their own revelation. The river flowing from the temple, the city with 12 gates, the tree of life. These images find fulfillment in the New Testament's descriptions of eternal existence. The prophet's vision bridges the gap between assurance and fulfillment. The Book of Revelation draws heavily on Ezekiel's imagery, adapting his visions for a fresh covenant community. The prophet's influence extends across the centuries, shaping how believers understand divine presence and human destiny. His strange visions become the foundation for Christian expectation. Islamic tradition also recognizes Ezekiel's import, honoring him as a prophet receiving divine revelation. The universality of his appeal suggests his vision touches something fundamental about human longing for divine presence and perfect community. Modern readers find in Ezekiel's vision principles transcending religious boundaries. His emphasis on fairness, his concern for the marginalized, his dream of a community where all have equal access to divine blessing. These themes resonate across cultures and centuries. The prophet's psychological insights prove remarkably enduring. His understanding of how trauma affects communities, how hope sustains community through crisis, how symbols communicate truths mere words cannot express. These observations remain relevant to contemporary experience. Ezekiel's strange personality becomes an asset rather than a liability. His willingness to appear foolish in ministry of divine truth demonstrates the cost of authentic prophecy. His example encourages others to speak difficult truths, regardless of personal consequences. The prophet's emphasis on personal responsibility balances his communal vision. He insists individuals must choose their own response to divine invitation. The restoration he envisions requires personal transformation, not just political change. The enduring power of Ezekiel's vision lies in its combination of specific detail and universal principle. The temple measurements anchor the vision in earthly reality, while the flowing river speaks to spiritual longings transcending time and location. The prophet's legacy challenges every generation to consider what it means to live in God's presence. His vision of holiness demands personal transformation. His dream of fairness requires social change. His expectation for restoration calls for faithful persistence through difficulty. The name he gives to the restored city captures the essence of his entire ministry. The Lord is there. This simple phrase summarizes the goal of all religious striving, the end of all spiritual searching. Where God is present, life flourishes. Where divine presence dwells, expectation becomes reality. Ezekiel's strange existence and enduring vision remind us God's ways often confound human expectations. The prophet, seeming most unlikely to offer hope, becomes the bearer of the most comprehensive vision of restoration. His legacy encourages us to look beyond present circumstances to divine possibilities. The prophet's final gift to his community is not just a vision of what lies ahead, but a way of perceiving the present. Through his eyes, displacement becomes preparation for return. Suffering becomes the prelude to glory. And the strangest prophet becomes the bearer of the most beautiful expectation.